Hello everyone, and welcome back to Mr. Sleepy Crime. I know many of you enjoy listening to these stories as you fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe, it really helps the channel grow. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that this story involves real people and real tragedies. We tell these stories not for entertainment, but to remember the victims and perhaps help others recognize the warning signs that could prevent similar tragedies. For the best experience, feel free to lower the volume a little, just enough to let the story gently carry you off to sleep. Alright, please get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's dive into tonight's first story. In the quiet neighborhood of Edgewater, Chicago, where Lake Michigan's gentle waves provide a soothing backdrop to daily life, a story unfolded that would shake the very foundations of how we think about domestic violence and the protection of innocent lives. This is the story of 11-year-old Jaden Perkins, a boy whose courage in the face of unimaginable terror would ultimately cost him his life, but whose memory would inspire legislative change and bring attention to the gaps in our justice system. The events of March 13, 2024, began like any other day for Lateria Smith and her children. She was 33 years old, pregnant, and working hard to build a safe life for her family in their Northside Chicago apartment. What she couldn't have known was that this ordinary Wednesday would become the day that changed everything, the day her past would collide violently with her present, and the day her 11-year-old son would make the ultimate sacrifice to protect her. To understand the full scope of this story, we need to understand the people at its center. Lateria Smith was a mother doing her best to provide for her children while navigating the complexities of life as a single parent in Chicago. She had a history with a man named Crosetti Brand that stretched back over a decade, a relationship that had ended but whose shadow would prove impossible to escape. Crosetti Brand, 39 years old at the time of the attack, was a man with a long history of violence against women. His criminal record painted a picture of someone who had spent most of his adult life terrorizing and abusing partners, cycling in and out of the justice system without ever truly being held accountable for the pattern of harm he created. Brand's relationship with Lateria Smith had been over for years, but in his mind, that relationship, and his perceived control over her, had never truly ended. At the center of this story is Jaden Perkins, an 11-year-old boy who loved his mother fiercely and had the kind of protective instinct that belied his young age. Jaden was the kind of child who would step up when his family needed him, who understood responsibility beyond his years, and who possessed a courage that would both define and end his brief life. The family lived in Edgewater, a neighborhood on Chicago's north side known for its diversity and its proximity to Lake Michigan. It's a community where families work hard to build better lives, where children play in local parks, and where neighbors know each other's names. It should have been a place where an 11-year-old boy could grow up safely, dreaming of his future and protected by the adults in his world. Crosetti Brand's history with the criminal justice system reads like a textbook case of how domestic violence escalates when left unchecked. For years, he had been in and out of jail for various offenses, many of them involving violence against women. Each time, he would serve his sentence, be released, and the cycle would begin again. The system, designed to rehabilitate and protect, had failed repeatedly to break this pattern. Brand's relationship with Lateria Smith had ended years earlier, but he had never truly accepted that ending. In the twisted logic of an abuser, he continued to see her as someone over whom he had rights, someone who couldn't simply walk away and build a new life without his permission. This is a common pattern in domestic violence cases, the inability of the abuser to accept that their control has ended, that their victim has moved on and found independence. The weeks and months leading up to March 13th had been particularly tense for Lateria and her family. Brand had been escalating his harassment, making threats, and creating an atmosphere of fear that permeated their daily lives. Lateria had done everything the system told her to do, she had reported the harassment, she had sought help from law enforcement, and she had begun the process of obtaining an order of protection. An order of protection, a legal document that prohibits one person from contacting or approaching another, can be a powerful tool in domestic violence cases. But like all tools, its effectiveness depends on enforcement and on the willingness of the system to take violations seriously. For Lateria Smith, the order of protection represented hope that the law would step between her family and the man who threatened them. What makes this case particularly tragic is the timing of the attack. Brand had been released from jail on March 12, 2024, just one day before he would break into Lateria's apartment and destroy her family. Even more devastating is the fact that March 13 was the very day Lateria was scheduled to appear in court to request her order of protection. The system's timing couldn't have been more cruelly ironic. On the day she was seeking legal protection from her abuser, he was free to carry out the violence she feared most. March 13, 2024, began like any other day in the Smith household. Lateria was preparing for her court appearance, a mix of hope and anxiety filling her thoughts as she got ready to formally request the protection she desperately needed. Her children were going about their morning routines, unaware that this day would mark a before and after in all their lives. The details of what happened next come from court testimony, police reports, and the harrowing account of Lateria Smith herself, a woman who survived an attack so brutal it's difficult to comprehend how she lived to tell about it. Brand had decided that if he couldn't control Lateria's life, he would end it. He made his way to her Edgewater apartment with deadly intent, carrying with him a knife and a rage that had been building for years. When he arrived at the apartment, he didn't knock or announce himself. Instead, he broke in, turning what should have been a safe haven into a battlefield. The home invasion began with Brand confronting Lateria, and quickly escalated into violence. He began stabbing her repeatedly, his fury unleashed without restraint. Lateria would later testify that she was stabbed 15 times during the attack, 15 wounds that should have killed her, but somehow didn't. Each stab wound was an attempt to end her life, to permanently silence the woman who had dared to seek independence from his control. It was at this moment of ultimate terror that 11-year-old Jaden Perkins made the decision that would define the final moments of his young life. Hearing his mother's screams, seeing the violence unfolding before him, Jaden didn't run or hide as any child might be expected to do. Instead, he ran toward the danger, positioning himself between his mother and her attacker. What happened next is both heartbreaking and inspiring in its demonstration of human courage at its purest. Jaden Perkins, weighing perhaps 80 pounds and standing barely 5 feet tall, faced down a 39-year-old man armed with a knife and consumed with murderous rage. The boy didn't hesitate, didn't calculate his chances, didn't think about his own safety. He simply knew his mother needed protection, and he was going to provide it. In the chaos of the attack, as Brand continued his assault on Lateria, Jaden threw himself into the fray. Court testimony would later reveal that the boy fought valiantly to protect his pregnant mother, using his small body as a shield against Brand's knife. For precious moments, Jaden's intervention gave his mother a chance to fight back, a chance to escape, a chance to live. But Brand's rage was not spent, and his weapon was designed for one purpose. In the struggle, he turned the knife on the boy who dared to interfere with his plan of revenge. Jaden Perkins was stabbed once in the chest, a single wound that would prove fatal. The knife found his heart, and the 11-year-old hero fell. The image of that moment, a child sacrificing his life to save his mother, is one that stays with everyone who has heard this story. Jaden didn't die immediately. He held on long enough for first responders to arrive, long enough to be rushed to the hospital, long enough for doctors to fight desperately to save his life. But the wound was too severe, and the little boy who had shown such courage in life couldn't overcome the trauma inflicted upon his small body. Lateria Smith, despite her 15 stab wounds, survived. She was critically injured and pregnant, fighting for her life in one hospital bed while her son fought for his in another. The horror of being attacked was compounded by the knowledge that her child had been hurt trying to protect her, a burden no parent should ever have to bear. The emergency response to the Edgewater apartment was swift but heartbreaking. First responders arrived to find a scene of devastating violence, a pregnant woman with multiple stab wounds and an 11-year-old boy clinging to life. The apartment that had been a family's home was now a crime scene, marked by bloodstains and the remnants of a life torn apart by violence. Neighbors in the building had heard the commotion and called 911, but the attack had unfolded with terrifying speed. The sound of breaking glass, screaming, and struggle had alerted them that something terrible was happening, but by the time help could arrive, the worst damage had already been done. Crosetti Brand didn't flee immediately after the attack. In fact, his behavior after stabbing Lateria and Jaden revealed the calculated nature of his violence. Court testimony would later reveal that he had also robbed the family during the attack, taking items from the apartment as if this was simply another transaction rather than the attempted murder of a mother and the actual murder of her child. When police arrived, they found Brand still in the vicinity of the apartment building. His arrest was swift, covered in blood and with clear evidence connecting him to the scene. There was no question about his involvement in the attack. But his capture was cold comfort for a family that had been shattered, for a community that had lost a child, and for a system that had failed to prevent a tragedy that many saw coming. The rush to the hospital became a race against time for both mother and son. Lateria Smith was rushed into emergency surgery, doctors working frantically to repair the damage from 15 stab wounds while also protecting her unborn child. The fact that she survived at all is testament to both medical skill and her own fierce will to live. Jaden was taken to a different hospital, where pediatric trauma specialists fought desperately to save his life. The single stab wound to his chest had caused massive internal damage, and despite the best efforts of the medical team, the 11-year-old boy succumbed to his injuries. The hero who had saved his mother's life couldn't be saved himself. The police investigation into the murder of Jaden Perkins was both straightforward and complex. Straightforward because the evidence was overwhelming. Brand had been caught at the scene, covered in blood, with clear physical evidence linking him to the attack. Complex because the case raised serious questions about how the system had allowed this tragedy to occur in the first place. Detectives quickly pieced together the timeline of events. Brand had been released from jail on parole just one day before the attack, a fact that would become central to later discussions about parole procedures and domestic violence cases. He had immediately made his way to Lateria Smith's apartment, suggesting that he had been planning this attack while still incarcerated. The investigation revealed that Brand had a key to Lateria's apartment, or had somehow obtained access to the building. This detail highlighted one of the most terrifying aspects of domestic violence, the way abusers often retain access to their victims' lives long after the relationship has officially ended. Whether through retained keys, knowledge of routines, or manipulation of security systems, abusers often find ways to breach the barriers their victims try to establish. Evidence collected from the scene painted a picture of a vicious and sustained attack. The blood spatter patterns, the location of injuries, and witness testimony all supported the prosecution's theory that Brand had come to the apartment with the intent to kill Lateria Smith, and that Jaden Perkins had died trying to prevent that murder. One of the most damning pieces of evidence was Brand's behavior during and after the attack. This wasn't a crime of passion or a moment of lost control. The robbery that accompanied the violence, the methodical nature of the stabbing, and his calm demeanor when arrested all pointed to a calculated act of revenge. The investigation also delved into Brand's history, revealing a pattern of domestic violence that stretched back years. Multiple women had been victims of his abuse, and the criminal justice system had repeatedly had opportunities to intervene more decisively. Each previous arrest, each sentence served, each parole granted, was now seen in a new light, as missed chances to prevent the murder of an 11-year-old boy. News of Jaden Perkins' murder sent shockwaves through the Edgewater community and beyond. The image of an 11-year-old boy dying to protect his pregnant mother struck a chord with people across Chicago and eventually across the nation. Vigils were organized, memorials were erected, and Jaden's story became a rallying cry for better protection of domestic violence victims. The community response was immediate and overwhelming. Neighbors who had never spoken to the Smith family found themselves leaving flowers at the building where the attack occurred. Local businesses donated money to help with medical expenses and funeral costs. Children at Jaden's school organized fundraisers and created artwork in his memory. But beyond the immediate outpouring of grief and support, Jaden's death sparked a broader conversation about domestic violence and systemic failures. Community advocates pointed to his case as an example of how the current system fails to protect victims and their families. They argued that Brand's release from jail just one day before the attack highlighted critical flaws in how parole decisions are made in domestic violence cases. Local domestic violence organizations used Jaden's story to illustrate the ripple effects of intimate partner violence. They pointed out that children are often the hidden victims in these cases, not just witnesses to violence, but often targets themselves, or, as in Jaden's case, protectors who pay the ultimate price for their courage. The media coverage of the case was extensive, but it was also respectful of the family's grief and focused on the broader issues the case highlighted. News outlets across the country picked up the story, not for its sensational elements, but for its tragic illustration of systemic problems that affect families nationwide. Religious communities also rallied around the family, organizing prayer services and offering spiritual support to Lateria Smith as she recovered from her injuries and grieved the loss of her son. The idea of a child making the ultimate sacrifice to protect his mother resonated deeply with people of faith, who saw in Jaden's actions an example of love and selflessness that transcended age and circumstances. The legal proceedings against Crosetti Brand began while Lateria Smith was still recovering from her injuries. The charges against him were severe and numerous: first-degree murder, attempted first-degree murder, home invasion, armed robbery, and multiple counts of domestic battery. Each charge carried the weight of what he had done, not just to Jaden and Lateria, but to a community that had been traumatized by his actions. In an unusual move that would complicate the proceedings, Brand chose to represent himself in court. This decision, known as proceeding pro se, is relatively rare in murder cases, particularly those as serious as this one. Brand's choice to act as his own attorney meant that he would be questioning witnesses, presenting his own defense, and essentially forcing Lateria Smith to face her attacker in court without the buffer of defense counsel. The decision to self-represent often stems from a defendant's desire to maintain control, even in circumstances where they have very little. For someone like Brand, who had spent his life trying to control and manipulate others, the courtroom may have seemed like another venue for exerting power. However, legal experts noted that self-representation in a capital murder case is extremely difficult and rarely successful. The prosecution, led by the Cook County State's Attorney's Office, built their case methodically. They had overwhelming physical evidence, compelling witness testimony, and a clear motive. The challenge would not be proving Brand's guilt, the evidence was too strong for that, but rather ensuring that the proceedings respected the dignity of the victims while also protecting Lateria Smith from further trauma. Pre-trial hearings revealed the strength of the prosecution's case. DNA evidence, fingerprints, witness testimony, and Brand's own statements to police all pointed to his guilt. The prosecution also had powerful testimony from neighbors who had heard the attack, medical professionals who had treated both victims, and first responders who had arrived at the scene. The defense, such as it was, with Brand representing himself, had few options. The evidence was overwhelming, and there were no credible alternative theories for what had happened. Brand's best hope might have been to plead guilty and hope for a sentence less than life in prison, but he seemed determined to force the case to trial. The trial of Crosetti Brand began in May 2025, more than a year after the murder of Jaden Perkins. The delay had allowed Lateria Smith time to physically recover from her injuries, though the emotional wounds would never fully heal. It had also allowed the legal system time to prepare for what would be an emotionally difficult and high-profile case. The prosecution's opening statement painted a clear picture of what had happened on March 13, 2024. They described Brand as a man who had terrorized women for most of his adult life, culminating in an attack so vicious that it claimed the life of an innocent child. They promised to show the jury evidence that would leave no doubt about Brand's guilt and the premeditated nature of his crimes. Brand's opening statement, delivered by himself, was rambling and unfocused. Without legal training, he struggled to present a coherent defense theory, instead focusing on perceived injustices in his own treatment by the system. His inability to mount an effective defense became clear from the very beginning of the trial. The prosecution's case unfolded systematically over several days. They called Lateria Smith as their first witness, requiring her to relive the most traumatic day of her life in front of the man who had tried to kill her. Her testimony was powerful and heartbreaking. She described the attack in detail, spoke about her son's courage, and made clear the devastating impact Brand's actions had had on her family. Medical testimony detailed the extent of Lateria's injuries, 15 stab wounds that should have been fatal but somehow weren't. The medical examiner who performed Jaden's autopsy testified about the single stab wound that had taken the boy's life, describing how the knife had penetrated his chest and caused fatal damage to his heart. Neighbors testified about what they had heard on the morning of the attack, the sounds of breaking glass, screaming, and struggle that had prompted them to call 911. Their testimony helped establish the timeline of events and painted a picture of the terror that had unfolded in the normally quiet apartment building. Police officers described finding Brand near the scene of the crime, covered in blood and initially uncooperative. They testified about the evidence collected from the apartment, bloodstains, fingerprints, and the weapon used in the attack. Each piece of evidence added another layer to the prosecution's case. Perhaps most damaging to Brand was the testimony about his criminal history and pattern of domestic violence. The prosecution was able to show that this wasn't an isolated incident but rather the culmination of years of escalating violence against women. They argued that Brand's history proved his intent and his danger to society. Brand's decision to represent himself proved to be disastrous for his case. Without legal training or experience, he was unable to effectively cross-examine witnesses, object to evidence, or present a coherent defense strategy. His questioning of witnesses often seemed to strengthen the prosecution's case rather than weakening it. When he cross-examined Lateria Smith, Brand's questions often seemed designed more to intimidate than to elicit information helpful to his defense. The judge had to intervene several times to prevent him from badgering the witness or asking inappropriate questions. His treatment of the woman he had tried to kill was painful to watch and likely damaged any sympathy the jury might have had for him. Brand's questioning of other witnesses was equally ineffective. He seemed to lack understanding of basic legal procedures, often asking questions that were objectionable or irrelevant to his case. His cross-examinations frequently reinforced the prosecution's points rather than challenging them. The prosecution had offered Brand a plea deal before trial, one that would have avoided the death penalty in exchange for a guilty plea. Brand's refusal to accept this deal, combined with his insistence on representing himself, suggested either supreme overconfidence or a fundamental misunderstanding of the strength of the case against him. When it came time for Brand to present his own case, he had little to offer. He called no witnesses and presented no evidence that contradicted the prosecution's narrative. His entire defense seemed to rest on the hope that he could somehow convince the jury that the overwhelming evidence against him wasn't credible. Legal observers noted that Brand's self-representation was a textbook example of why the phrase, "a person who represents himself as a fool for a client," exists. His lack of legal knowledge, combined with his apparent inability to separate his emotions from legal strategy, made it impossible for him to mount an effective defense. The trial also highlighted the challenges that domestic violence cases present for the legal system. Having the defendant represent himself meant that Lateria Smith was essentially being cross-examined by the man who had tried to kill her and who had killed her son. It was a form of continued abuse played out in the formal setting of a courtroom. The jury deliberation in the Brand case was remarkably swift. After hearing days of testimony and seeing overwhelming evidence of his guilt, the jurors needed less than 90 minutes to reach their verdict. On all counts, first-degree murder, attempted first-degree murder, home invasion, armed robbery, and domestic battery, they found Crosetti Brand guilty. The speed of the deliberation spoke to the strength of the prosecution's case and the clarity of the evidence. There had been no credible alternative theory of the crime presented by the defense, no reasonable doubt created about Brand's guilt, and no mitigation evidence that might have reduced the severity of the charges. When the verdict was read, Lateria Smith was in the courtroom, surrounded by family and supporters. For her, the guilty verdict represented a form of justice for her son, though nothing could bring Jayden back or undo the trauma her family had experienced. The verdict meant that Brand would be held accountable for his actions and that he would never again be able to harm her or her remaining children. The conviction on first-degree murder carried with it the possibility of a life sentence without parole. The attempted murder conviction, along with the home invasion and robbery charges, meant that even if Brand hadn't been convicted of murder, he would have faced decades in prison. For the community that had rallied around Jayden's memory, the verdict provided some measure of closure. It confirmed what everyone already knew, that Brand was responsible for the death of an innocent child and the near death of his mother. It validated their grief and their anger, and it promised that Brand would be held accountable. The verdict also represented a victory for the prosecutors who had worked tirelessly to build their case. They had successfully navigated the unusual circumstances of a self-represented defendant while ensuring that the dignity of the victims was preserved and that justice was served. But for those who had followed the case closely, the verdict also highlighted the tragic nature of the crime. An 11-year-old boy was dead, a family was shattered, and a community was traumatized, all because the system had failed to adequately protect a domestic violence victim and her children. The sentencing hearing for Crosetti Brand took place in August 2025, several months after his conviction. The delay allowed for the preparation of victim impact statements and gave the court time to consider the appropriate punishment for crimes that had shocked the community and exposed serious flaws in the criminal justice system. Lateria Smith's victim impact statement was the centerpiece of the sentencing hearing. Standing before the man who had killed her son and tried to kill her, she spoke directly about the impact his actions had had on her life and the lives of her remaining children. Her words were powerful and heartbreaking, describing not just the physical pain she had endured, but the emotional devastation of losing Jayden. "You have taken away one of the greatest gifts God has blessed me with," she told Brand during the hearing. Her statement detailed how the attack had affected every aspect of her life, her ability to feel safe, her children's sense of security, and her own struggle to heal both physically and emotionally from the trauma. Family members also spoke at the hearing, describing Jayden as a loving child who had always been protective of his family. They talked about his dreams, his personality, and the future that had been stolen from him. Their statements painted a picture of a boy who had been full of life and potential, making his death all the more tragic. The judge, in imposing sentence, noted the particularly heinous nature of the crime. Brand was sentenced to natural life in prison without the possibility of parole for the murder of Jayden Perkins. Additionally, he received 60 years for the attempted murder of Lateria Smith, another 60 years for home invasion, and additional time for the other charges. In total, his sentence amounted to life plus 120 years in prison. The sentence ensured that Brand would never again be free to harm anyone. At 39 years old at the time of sentencing, he would spend the rest of his life in prison, paying for the choices he had made on March 13, 2024. The length of the sentence reflected not just the severity of his crimes, but also his long history of violence against women. For Lateria Smith, the sentencing provided some measure of closure, though she made clear that no sentence could ever truly provide justice for the loss of her son. The knowledge that Brand would never be free again offered some comfort, but it couldn't undo the trauma or bring Jayden back. The sentencing also served as a message to other domestic abusers and to the system itself. The judge's comments made clear that domestic violence, particularly when it escalates to murder, would be punished to the full extent of the law. The sentence was a statement that society would not tolerate the kind of systematic abuse and violence that Brand had perpetrated. The murder of Jayden Perkins exposed serious flaws in how the criminal justice system handles domestic violence cases, particularly when it comes to parole and the protection of victims and their families. Brand's release from jail just one day before the attack became a focal point for criticism of current procedures and policies. The timing of Brand's release highlighted several problematic aspects of the parole system. He had been released without adequate consideration of the threat he posed to Lateria Smith and her family. There had been no notification to the victims, no safety planning, and no conditions of release that might have prevented or delayed the attack. Critics of the system pointed out that domestic violence cases require special consideration when it comes to parole and release decisions. The psychological dynamics of intimate partner abuse mean that victims are often at greatest risk when their abusers are released from incarceration. The period immediately following release is particularly dangerous, as abusers may be motivated by anger about their imprisonment and eager to reassert control. The fact that Brand's attack occurred on the very day that Lateria was scheduled to seek an order of protection added another layer of tragic irony to the case. The order of protection, a tool designed to provide safety for domestic violence victims, came too late to save her family. This timing raised questions about how quickly the system responds to requests for protection and whether current procedures are adequate to protect victims in crisis. Lateria Smith herself became an advocate for reform in the wake of her son's murder. She wrote open letters to government agencies, pointing out the failures that had led to her tragedy and calling for changes that might prevent similar incidents in the future. Her advocacy was informed by lived experience and carried the weight of unimaginable loss. The case also highlighted the broader impact of domestic violence on children. Jayden had been what experts call a secondary victim of domestic violence, not the primary target, but someone whose life was profoundly affected by the abuse in his family. His death underscored the need for the system to consider and protect all members of families affected by domestic violence, not just the primary victims. Mental health professionals who followed the case noted that children in domestic violence situations often develop heightened protective instincts, feeling responsible for keeping their parents safe. Jayden's actions on the morning of March 13 reflected this pattern, a child who felt compelled to step between his mother and danger, regardless of the cost to himself. Jayden Perkins' death was not in vain. His story became a catalyst for legislative and policy changes designed to better protect domestic violence victims and their families. Politicians, advocates, and community leaders rallied around his memory to push for reforms that might prevent similar tragedies in the future. One of the key areas of focus was parole procedures in domestic violence cases. Advocates argued for mandatory notification of victims when their abusers are released from incarceration, longer waiting periods before release, and more stringent conditions of parole that take into account the risk to specific individuals. There were also calls for better coordination between different parts of the criminal justice system. The fact that Brand was released just as Lateria was seeking an order of protection suggested a lack of communication between agencies that could have prevented the tragedy. Improved information sharing and coordination became key priorities for reform. The case also sparked broader conversations about resource allocation for domestic violence prevention and intervention. Community organizations argued that the tragedy might have been prevented with better funding for victim services, more comprehensive threat assessment procedures, and improved training for law enforcement and court personnel. Educational initiatives grew out of Jayden's story as well. His courage in protecting his mother became a powerful example of love and sacrifice, but it also highlighted the need to teach children about domestic violence and how to seek help safely. Educators and social workers used his story to develop age-appropriate programs about recognizing abuse and getting adult help. The anniversary of Jayden's death became an annual remembrance in the Edgewater community, with vigils and community events that kept his memory alive while also raising awareness about domestic violence prevention. These events served both as memorials to a lost child and as ongoing education opportunities for community members. Lateria Smith's continued advocacy kept her son's story in the public eye and ensured that the lessons of his death were not forgotten. Her appearances at legislative hearings, community events, and media interviews kept pressure on officials to implement the reforms that his death had highlighted as necessary. The ripple effects of Jayden Perkins' murder continue to be felt throughout Chicago and beyond. His story has become a touchstone for discussions about domestic violence, child protection, and system reform. The image of an 11-year-old boy sacrificing his life to protect his pregnant mother has resonated with people across the country and around the world. For Lateria Smith, the journey of healing continues. She has had to rebuild her life while carrying the dual burden of trauma survivor and grieving mother. Her strength in the face of unimaginable loss has inspired others, but it has come at a cost that no one should have to pay. She continues to advocate for system changes while also working to provide for her remaining children and to keep Jaden's memory alive. The Edgewater community has also been forever changed by the events of March 13, 2024. The building where the attack occurred serves as a daily reminder of what was lost, but also of the need for vigilance in protecting vulnerable community members. Neighbors have become more aware of signs of domestic violence and more willing to intervene when they suspect someone is in danger. The broader domestic violence advocacy community has embraced Jaden's story as an example of why their work is so important. His death serves as a stark reminder of what happens when the system fails, when warning signs are ignored, and when dangerous individuals are allowed to harm others without adequate intervention. Law enforcement agencies have also used the case as a training opportunity, examining the decisions that led up to the tragedy and identifying points where different choices might have led to different outcomes. The case has become part of training curricula for police officers, parole officers, and other criminal justice professionals. The legal community has debated the case as well, particularly Brand's decision to represent himself and the challenges that created for ensuring a fair trial while protecting the victims from further trauma. The case has informed discussions about how courts can better manage self-represented defendants in sensitive cases. At the heart of this tragic story is an 11-year-old boy whose life was cut short by violence he should never have encountered. Jaden Perkins was more than just a victim, he was a son, a brother, a student, and a community member with dreams and potential that will never be realized. Those who knew Jaden remember him as a protective big brother who looked out for his family. He was the kind of child who took responsibility seriously, who could be counted on to help when needed, and who possessed a maturity that sometimes surprised adults. His teachers remember him as a good student who was kind to his classmates and respectful to adults. In the final moments of his life, Jaden displayed courage that most adults never have to summon. Faced with a life-threatening situation, he didn't hesitate to put himself in harm's way to protect his mother. His actions on March 13, 2024, defined him not as a victim, but as a hero, a child who paid the ultimate price for love. The circumstances of Jaden's death were horrific, but the love and bravery he showed in his final moments speak to something beautiful about human nature. Even in the face of evil, even when confronted with violence and hatred, love and courage can still shine through. Jaden's sacrifice saved his mother's life and ensured that his unborn sibling would have a chance to live. Memorial funds established in Jaden's name have helped other families affected by domestic violence, ensuring that his death contributes to preventing future tragedies. Scholarships in his honor will help other children get the education and opportunities he will never have. Community gardens and playground equipment dedicated to his memory provide spaces for other children to play and grow safely. The annual vigils held in Jaden's memory serve multiple purposes. They honor a life lost too soon, they provide comfort to a grieving community, and they maintain focus on the work that still needs to be done to prevent domestic violence. Each candle lit in his memory represents a commitment to creating a world where children like Jaden don't have to make such sacrifices. The murder of Jaden Perkins cannot be understood in isolation. It exists within the broader context of domestic violence in America, a problem that affects millions of families and claims thousands of lives each year. According to the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence, an average of 20 people per minute are physically abused by an intimate partner in the United States. That translates to more than 10 million men and women over the course of a year. What makes Jaden's case particularly significant is how it illuminates the often overlooked impact of domestic violence on children. While Lateria Smith was the primary target of Brand's violence, her children lived in the shadow of that threat every day. They experienced the fear, the instability, and ultimately, the tragic consequences of domestic abuse. Children in homes where domestic violence occurs are at significantly higher risk of being abused themselves, and they often suffer long-lasting psychological effects from witnessing violence between their parents or caregivers. The statistics surrounding domestic violence and children are sobering. Studies show that children who witness domestic violence are more likely to become abusers themselves or to enter into abusive relationships as adults, perpetuating a cycle of violence across generations. They're more likely to struggle in school, to have behavioral problems, and to suffer from anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress disorder. Jaden's story also highlights the particular vulnerability of families attempting to leave abusive relationships. Contrary to popular belief, the most dangerous time for a domestic violence victim is often when they try to leave their abuser or shortly after they have left. This is when abusers feel their control slipping away and may resort to extreme violence to reassert their dominance or to punish their victims for seeking independence. The fact that Brand's attack occurred on the very day that Lateria was seeking legal protection through an order of protection is tragically typical of how domestic violence escalates. Abusers often see their victims' attempts to seek help or legal protection as acts of betrayal that must be punished. The order of protection, which should have been a source of safety, instead may have triggered the very violence it was meant to prevent. This paradox, that seeking help can sometimes increase danger, creates an impossible situation for domestic violence victims. They need protection from their abusers, but the act of seeking that protection can provoke the very violence they're trying to escape. It's a catch-22 that highlights the need for better coordination between different parts of the system and more comprehensive safety planning for victims and their families. The story of Jaden Perkins is ultimately a call to action, a demand that we do better as individuals, as communities, and as a society in protecting vulnerable people from violence. His death was preventable, and similar deaths in the future remain preventable if we have the will and the wisdom to learn from this tragedy. The systemic failures that led to Jaden's death, the inadequate parole procedures, the poor coordination between agencies, the delayed response to requests for protection, are not insurmountable problems. They are challenges that can be addressed through better policies, increased resources, improved training, and sustained commitment to reform. But addressing these systemic issues requires more than just policy changes and institutional reforms. It requires a cultural shift in how we think about domestic violence and our collective responsibility to address it. We must move beyond seeing domestic violence as a private matter between individuals to recognizing it as a public health and safety issue that affects entire communities. This cultural shift involves challenging attitudes and beliefs that enable domestic violence to flourish, ideas about male entitlement and control, beliefs that minimize the seriousness of intimate partner abuse, and assumptions that domestic violence only affects certain types of people or communities. It requires honest conversations about power, gender, and violence that many people would prefer to avoid. The shift also requires each of us to examine our own willingness to get involved when we suspect someone is being abused. Too often, people who observe warning signs of domestic violence choose to mind their own business rather than reaching out to offer support or resources. Jaden's death reminds us that this choice to remain uninvolved can have deadly consequences. For those working in systems that interact with domestic violence victims and perpetrators, law enforcement, courts, healthcare, education, social services, Jaden's story serves as a reminder of the life and death importance of their work. Every decision about parole, every response to a victim's request for help, every opportunity to intervene in a pattern of abuse carries the potential to prevent tragedies like this one. For community members, Jaden's story is a call to become more aware of domestic violence in their neighborhoods and more willing to support victims and their families. It's a reminder that domestic violence thrives in isolation and secrecy, and that community awareness and support can be powerful tools for both prevention and intervention. For parents and educators, the story highlights the importance of teaching children about healthy relationships, appropriate ways to seek help, and the understanding that protecting adults is not their responsibility. While we celebrate Jaden's courage, we must also work to ensure that other children never face similar situations. As we close this story, we remember that it began with a family seeking safety and ends with a community committed to preventing future tragedies. Jaden Perkins died protecting his mother, but his legacy lives on in the countless efforts being made to create a world where such protection is unnecessary, where families can live free from violence, where children can grow up safely, and where the systems designed to protect us actually fulfill that promise. The soft breathing of those listening to this story in the quiet of night reminds us that peace and safety are precious gifts that too many people in our world lack. In remembering Jaden Perkins, in honoring his courage, and in committing ourselves to the work of prevention, we take steps toward a world where all children can sleep safely, protected by the adults in their lives rather than being forced to serve as protectors themselves. His story ends here, but the work his death has inspired continues. Each policy changed in his memory, each life saved through improved domestic violence intervention, each community made safer through increased awareness represents a victory for the 11-year-old hero who gave everything to save his mother and whose death must never be in vain. Please, if you're new here, welcome to the channel, where we explore true crime stories in a calm and respectful way. I also want to take a moment to appreciate my amazing subscribers who've been rocking with me. Thank you so much for your continued support. If you're still awake and listening, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and the current time in your corner of the world, or just say something to let me know you're still here. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe, so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Now, let's move on to our second story. Story 2. In the quiet hours when the world settles into darkness, some stories demand to be told, not for their shock value, but for the lives they honor and the lessons they carry. Tonight, we turn back the pages of time to March 28, 1988, in Nashville, Tennessee, where a single act of violence would forever change multiple families and raise questions about love, jealousy, and the devastating consequences of uncontrolled rage. This is the story of Angela Clay, a 29-year-old mother trying to rebuild her life, and her two young daughters, 9-year-old Latoya and 6-year-old Lakeisha. Their story is one that began with hope for a new beginning but ended in a tragedy that would haunt Nashville for decades to come. Angela Clay was a woman caught between two worlds in 1988. At 29, she found herself navigating the complex terrain of single motherhood while trying to forge a new path for herself and her daughters. Like many women of her generation, Angela had married young, and her relationship with her husband Benny Clay had become strained over time, eventually leading to their separation. The late 1980s in Nashville were a time of change and growth. The city was evolving from its traditional roots into a more modern metropolitan area, but for working-class families like the Clays, daily life remained a constant balance of responsibilities and dreams deferred. Angela worked hard to provide for Latoya and Lakeisha, two bright children who represented everything good in her world. Latoya, at 9 years old, was beginning to develop her own personality and interests. She was the kind of child who asked endless questions, always curious about the world around her. Her teachers described her as engaged and thoughtful, a student who showed promise and brought joy to those who knew her. She had that special quality that some children possess, an ability to light up a room simply by being present. 6-year-old Lakeisha, whose name was sometimes spelled Lakeisha in court documents, was still in those precious early elementary years where everything seemed possible. She had recently celebrated her 6th birthday on March 8, just weeks before the tragedy that would end her young life. Like her sister, Lakeisha was known for her bright smile and the way she could make adults laugh with her innocent observations about the world. The girls lived with their mother in a South Nashville apartment, a modest but clean home where Angela tried to create stability despite the challenges of single parenthood. The neighborhood was working class, filled with families facing similar struggles and triumphs. It was the kind of place where neighbors knew each other's names and children played together in the courtyards and sidewalks. Angela's separation from her husband Benny had been difficult, as these situations often are. There were lingering tensions, unresolved issues, and the complex emotions that come with the dissolution of a marriage when children are involved. Benny remained connected to the girls' lives, but the relationship between the former spouses was strained, creating an undercurrent of tension that would later play a significant role in the tragic events to come. Into this already complex situation came Byron Lewis Black, a man whose life had been marked by violence and poor decisions long before he met Angela Clay. Born on March 23, 1956, Byron was 32 years old when he entered Angela's life, a man with a criminal history that should have served as a warning of the danger he posed. Byron's past was troubled in ways that reflected larger societal issues of the time: lack of mental health resources, cycles of violence, and a criminal justice system that struggled to address repeat offenders effectively. He had already demonstrated a propensity for violence, particularly in situations involving romantic relationships, a pattern that would prove deadly for the Clay family. What drew Angela to Byron remains one of those mysteries that families and friends struggle to understand in the aftermath of domestic violence tragedies. Perhaps it was his initial charm, or maybe the promise of companionship during a lonely period in her life. Whatever the attraction, their relationship developed despite red flags that, in retrospect, seem glaring. The most significant of these warning signs was Byron's history with Angela's estranged husband, Benny. Before the murders, Byron had already demonstrated his capacity for violence by shooting and wounding Benny Clay during an altercation. This incident should have ended any relationship between Byron and Angela, but instead, it seems to have intensified the complex dynamics at play. Rather than being incarcerated for the shooting, Byron was sentenced to a work release program, a decision that would prove tragically inadequate given his dangerous nature. Work release programs were designed to help offenders transition back into society while serving their sentences, but in Byron's case, the program provided him with the freedom he would use to commit far more heinous crimes. The work release arrangement meant that Byron had access to the community during certain hours while returning to custody at designated times. This system relied heavily on the offender's compliance and good faith participation, qualities that Byron clearly lacked. His ability to move freely during work release hours would provide the opportunity for the murders that were to come. The weeks leading up to March 28, 1988, were marked by increasing tension and instability in the relationship between Byron and Angela. Friends and family members later reported signs of escalating problems, though the full extent of the danger may not have been apparent to those closest to the situation. Domestic violence experts often speak of the pattern of escalation that leads to homicide in abusive relationships. The warning signs include increasing possessiveness, threats of violence, obsession with the victim's activities, and a sense of ownership over the partner that goes far beyond normal relationship dynamics. Byron's behavior toward Angela appears to have exhibited many of these dangerous characteristics. The complexity of Angela's situation was compounded by the presence of her two young daughters. Many victims of domestic violence struggle with the decision to leave abusive relationships, weighing their own safety against concerns about their children's well-being, financial security, and the fear of retaliation. For Angela, these calculations became even more complicated given Byron's history of violence toward her estranged husband. March 28, 1988, dawned like any other spring day in Nashville. The city was experiencing the renewal that comes with the changing seasons, and life continued its normal rhythm for most residents. Angela went about her daily routines, caring for LaToya and Lakeisha, probably thinking about work, school activities, and the mundane but precious details of family life. What triggered Byron's final violent outburst on that March evening remains a matter of speculation and court testimony. Prosecutors would later argue that he acted out of jealous rage, a motive that fits the pattern of possessive behavior that often precedes domestic violence homicides. The exact circumstances of how Byron gained access to the apartment that night, whether Angela let him in or he forced his way inside, became part of the complex web of evidence that investigators would piece together. What is certain is that sometime that evening, Byron Lewis Black made the decision to use deadly force against Angela and her daughters. The violence that followed would be swift and brutal, leaving no survivors to tell the story of what happened in those final moments. The Clay family's absence from their normal routines first raised concerns among people who knew them. when Angela failed to appear for work and the girls were absent from school, friends and relatives began to worry. This was not characteristic behavior for Angela, who was known to be responsible and reliable in her obligations. The concern grew as attempts to reach Angela by phone went unanswered. In 1988, communication options were limited compared to today's world of cell phones and instant messaging. When someone couldn't be reached at home, it often meant waiting and trying again later, or physically going to check on them. It was concerned relatives who finally decided to take action. On the evening of March 29, they contacted the Nashville Metropolitan Police Department to request a welfare check at Angela's South Nashville apartment. The decision to call police represented a recognition that something was seriously wrong. Family members knew Angela well enough to understand that her silence was ominous. When police officers arrived at the apartment, they found a scene that would haunt the investigators for years to come. The door to the apartment revealed no signs of forced entry, suggesting that Angela had either known her killer or that he had gained access through deception or coercion. Inside the modest home where Angela had tried to build a safe haven for her daughters, officers discovered the brutal reality of what had occurred the previous evening. Angela Clay was found shot to death in her bed, the place where she should have been most secure and peaceful. The violence inflicted upon her spoke to the rage and hatred that had motivated her killer. The discovery of 9-year-old LaToya was particularly heartbreaking for the responding officers. She had been shot through the neck and chest and was found in the bedroom with her mother. The image of this young girl, who had been looking forward to growing up and experiencing all that life had to offer, would become one of those scenes that experienced police officers never forget. Perhaps most tragic of all was the discovery of 6-year-old Lakeisha, found lying face down elsewhere in the apartment. She too had been shot, her young life ended by the same weapon that had killed her mother and sister. The sight of this little girl, who had celebrated her 6th birthday just weeks before, represented the ultimate innocence destroyed by senseless violence. The crime scene told a story of methodical violence. This was not a crime of passion that ended quickly, but rather a deliberate act of murder that had claimed 3 lives. The positioning of the bodies and the nature of the wound suggested that Byron had moved through the apartment systematically, ensuring that no one survived to identify him or testify against him. The Nashville Metropolitan Police Department launched an intensive investigation into the triple homicide, recognizing immediately that they were dealing with a case that would demand their best efforts. The murder of children always galvanizes law enforcement, and the brutal nature of these crimes made finding the killer a top priority. Detective work in 1988 relied heavily on traditional investigative techniques, interviewing witnesses, following up on leads, examining physical evidence, and building a case through methodical police work. DNA analysis was still in its infancy as a forensic tool, so investigators had to rely on ballistics, fingerprints, and witness testimony to build their case. The investigation quickly focused on Byron Lewis Black for several compelling reasons. His relationship with Angela was well known to family members and friends, and his history of violence toward the Clay family made him an immediate suspect. Most significantly, his work release status meant that his whereabouts during the time of the murders could be tracked and verified. When investigators examined Byron's activities on March 28, they discovered that he had failed to return to custody as required by his work release program. This violation of his sentence conditions placed him in the area at the time of the murders and demonstrated a willful disregard for the legal restrictions that were supposed to be controlling his behavior. Ballistics evidence would prove crucial to the case. The gun used in the murders was recovered and traced back to Byron, providing physical evidence linking him to the crime scene. In 1988, ballistics matching was a well-established forensic technique, and the evidence clearly showed that the same weapon had been used to kill all 3 victims. Witness testimony also played a significant role in building the case against Byron. Neighbors reported hearing gunshots on the evening of March 28, though like many people in urban environments, they had not immediately recognized the sounds as weapons fire. The timing of these reports corresponded with the estimated time of death for the victims. Friends and family members provided investigators with crucial background information about the relationship between Byron and Angela, painting a picture of escalating tension and possessive behavior. This testimony helped establish motive and provided context for understanding why this particular act of violence had occurred. The investigation also revealed the tragic irony that Byron had been allowed the freedom to commit these murders while supposedly being punished for his previous act of violence against the Clay family. The work release program that was intended to facilitate his rehabilitation had instead provided him with the opportunity to escalate his criminal behavior to the level of triple homicide. Byron Lewis Black's arrest came relatively quickly once investigators had assembled the evidence against him. His failure to return to custody after the work release program had already made him a fugitive, and the murder charges elevated the manhunt to a higher priority level. When Byron was taken into custody, he initially attempted to deny involvement in the murders, a common response among defendants facing serious criminal charges. However, the physical evidence and witness testimony created a compelling case that would be difficult to refute in court. The legal proceedings that followed would span several years and involve complex questions about Byron's mental state, his criminal history, and the appropriate punishment for someone who had committed such heinous crimes. The case highlighted issues that continue to challenge the criminal justice system today: how to handle repeat violent offenders, the effectiveness of alternative sentencing programs, and the difficulty of predicting and preventing domestic violence escalation. Byron's defense team faced the challenging task of representing a client whose guilt seemed apparent based on the evidence. Their strategy focused on attempting to avoid the death penalty by arguing mitigating factors, including Byron's mental health issues and troubled background. This approach acknowledged the likelihood of conviction while trying to save their client's life. The prosecution, meanwhile, built their case around the brutal nature of the crimes and the fact that Byron had murdered 2 innocent children in addition to Angela. They argued that his previous violence toward the Clay family demonstrated a pattern of escalating behavior that had culminated in these murders. The fact that he committed the crimes while on work release showed a complete disregard for the law and the opportunities he had been given for rehabilitation. The trial proceedings were emotionally difficult for everyone involved, particularly the surviving family members who had lost Angela, LaToya, and Lakeisha. Court testimony required them to relive the trauma of the murders while also celebrating the lives of the victims who had been taken from them. Benny Clay, Angela's estranged husband and the father of the 2 murdered girls, faced the unimaginable grief of losing his children to violence. His previous shooting by Byron added another layer of complexity to his experience as a victim and witness in the case. The man who had already wounded him had now murdered his daughters and their mother. After reviewing all the evidence and hearing testimony from witnesses, the jury found Byron Lewis Black guilty on 3 counts of first-degree murder. The conviction was not surprising given the strength of the evidence against him, but it provided some measure of justice for the Clay family and the community that had been shocked by the brutal nature of these crimes. The sentencing phase of the trial proved more complex, as is often the case in capital murder cases. The prosecution sought the death penalty, particularly for the murder of 6-year-old Lakeisha, arguing that the killing of such a young child represented the most heinous form of criminal behavior. They emphasized that Byron had shown no mercy to innocent victims who posed no threat to him. The defense presented mitigating evidence about Byron's background, mental health issues, and troubled upbringing in an attempt to convince the jury to spare his life. This strategy acknowledged his guilt while arguing that life imprisonment would be a more appropriate punishment than execution. In the end, the jury reached a mixed verdict on sentencing. Byron Lewis Black received life sentences for the murders of Angela Clay and 9-year-old LaToya Clay. However, for the murder of 6-year-old Lakeisha Clay, the jury imposed the death penalty, apparently believing that the killing of such a young child warranted the ultimate punishment. This sentencing pattern reflected the jury's recognition that while all 3 murders were heinous, the killing of the youngest victim represented a particularly egregious crime. Lakeisha's age and complete innocence made her murder especially difficult for the jury to contemplate, leading them to conclude that only the death penalty could provide appropriate justice. The death sentence meant that Byron would join Tennessee's death row population, beginning what would become decades of appeals and legal proceedings. The appeals process in capital cases is lengthy and complex, designed to ensure that no innocent person is executed and that all legal issues are thoroughly examined. Byron Lewis Black's time on death row stretched for over 3 decades, a period that saw significant changes in Tennessee's death penalty system and ongoing legal challenges to capital punishment across the United States. During these years, he became part of the complex machinery of the appeals process, with lawyers arguing various aspects of his case and conviction. The lengthy appeals process in capital cases serves multiple purposes, ensuring that all legal issues are properly examined, providing time for new evidence to emerge if it exists, and allowing for consideration of changing legal standards regarding the death penalty. In Byron's case, his attorneys raised various issues over the years, including questions about his mental competency and the adequacy of his original defense representation. Throughout this period, the families of Angela, LaToya, and Lakeisha Clay lived with the knowledge that their loved one's killer remained alive while their family members were gone forever. The extended appeals process, while necessary from a legal standpoint, prolonged their pain and prevented final closure on this tragic chapter of their lives. The case also became part of ongoing discussions about the effectiveness of the death penalty as a deterrent to violent crime and the costs associated with maintaining capital punishment systems. Byron's case, like many others, highlighted the enormous financial and emotional resources required to carry out death sentences in the modern American legal system. As the years passed, Byron developed serious health issues, including heart problems that would eventually require the implantation of a defibrillator device. This medical condition would later raise unique legal and ethical questions about the execution process, as attorneys argued that lethal injection could cause the defibrillator to malfunction and inflict unnecessary suffering. The presence of the defibrillator created a situation that had rarely been encountered in the history of capital punishment. Medical experts debated whether the device should be deactivated before execution and what effects the lethal injection drugs might have on the implanted device. These discussions highlighted the complex intersection of medical technology and capital punishment in modern times. After more than 37 years on death row, Byron Lewis Black's execution was finally scheduled for August 2025. The lengthy delay between sentencing and execution reflected the comprehensive appeals process that characterizes capital punishment cases in the United States, where multiple courts review every aspect of the conviction and sentence. The final legal proceedings focused heavily on the medical issues surrounding Byron's defibrillator device. His attorneys argued that the execution should be delayed until the device could be properly deactivated, claiming that leaving it active during lethal injection could cause additional suffering that would violate constitutional protections against cruel and unusual punishment. Medical professionals were divided on the potential effects of performing lethal injection on someone with an active defibrillator. Some argued that the device could malfunction and deliver painful electrical shocks during the execution process, while others contended that the drugs used in lethal injection would render the person unconscious before any such problems could occur. The courts ultimately rejected the appeals for delay, ruling that the medical concerns, while noted, were not sufficient to prevent the execution from proceeding as scheduled. This decision reflected the broader legal principle that convicted murderers cannot indefinitely delay their sentences based on medical conditions that developed after their crimes were committed. On August 5, 2025, Byron Lewis Black was executed by lethal injection at the Riverbend Maximum Security Institution in Nashville, Tennessee. He was 69 years old at the time of his death, having spent more than half of his adult life on death row for the murders he committed in 1988. The execution brought to a close one of Tennessee's longest-running death penalty cases and provided a form of final justice for the Clay family members who had waited decades to see Byron's sentence carried out. For Benny Clay and other surviving family members, the execution represented the end of a legal process that had lasted longer than LaToya and Lakeisha had been alive. During the execution, Byron reportedly expressed pain and distress, though medical personnel and corrections officials indicated that the procedure was carried out according to standard protocols. The concerns about his defibrillator device appeared to be realized to some extent, though the exact medical details of what occurred were not immediately made public. The murders of Angela, LaToya, and Lakeisha Clay represent more than just another tragic crime story. They highlight numerous societal issues that remain relevant today. The case illustrates the deadly potential of domestic violence escalation, the challenges of managing violent offenders in the community, and the complex questions surrounding capital punishment in American society. Angela Clay's story reflects the experiences of countless women who find themselves trapped in relationships with violent partners. Her attempt to move forward with her life after separating from her husband led her into another dangerous situation with Byron Black, demonstrating how difficult it can be for victims of domestic violence to find safety and stability. The murders also highlighted flaws in the work release program that allowed Byron the freedom to commit these crimes. His previous shooting of Benny Clay should have identified him as someone who posed an ongoing danger to the Clay family, yet he was granted privileges that enabled him to access his victims when he decided to escalate his violent behavior. The lengthy legal process that followed the murders raises questions about the effectiveness and efficiency of the capital punishment system. While the appeals process serves important purposes in ensuring justice and preventing wrongful executions, the decades-long delay between sentencing and execution can be traumatic for victims' families and costly for taxpayers. The case also demonstrates the ripple effects of violent crime on communities and families. Benny Clay lost not only his estranged wife but his 2 young daughters, forever altering the trajectory of his life. Extended family members, friends, neighbors, and community members were all impacted by the brutal nature of these murders. For law enforcement and criminal justice professionals, the Clay family murders serve as a reminder of the importance of taking domestic violence seriously and recognizing the warning signs of escalating danger. Byron's history of violence toward the Clay family should have been treated as a predictor of future harm, with appropriate measures taken to protect potential victims. The story of Angela, LaToya, and Lakeisha Clay also serves as a testament to the preciousness of life and the devastating impact of violence on innocent people. Angela was a young mother trying to build a better life for herself and her children. LaToya was a bright 9-year-old with her whole future ahead of her. Lakeisha was a 6-year-old child who had barely begun to experience the world. Their lives mattered, and their deaths represent not just statistics in crime databases but the loss of human potential and the destruction of a family unit. Angela would never see her daughters grow up, graduate from school, or have families of their own. LaToya and Lakeisha would never experience the joys and challenges of adolescence, young adulthood, and all the milestones that make up a full life. As we reach the end of this tragic story, it's important to remember that true crime narratives serve a purpose beyond entertainment or curiosity about human darkness. They remind us of the real people behind the headlines, the families who continue to grieve long after the news coverage ends, and the ongoing work needed to prevent similar tragedies. The Clay family murders occurred over 37 years ago, but the issues they highlight remain relevant today. Domestic violence continues to claim lives, the criminal justice system still struggles with how to manage violent offenders effectively, and families across the country continue to face the devastating impact of violence in their communities. Perhaps the most important lesson from this story is the need for vigilance in protecting vulnerable people from those who would harm them. Angela Clay's death, along with the murders of her 2 innocent daughters, represents a failure of multiple systems designed to keep people safe, from the work release program that gave Byron Black access to his victims to the social systems that failed to adequately protect a woman trying to escape a dangerous situation. As we reflect on this case in the quiet hours of the night, let us remember Angela, LaToya, and Lakeisha Clay not just as victims of violence, but as human beings who lived, loved, and deserved the chance to continue their stories. Their lives were cut short by senseless violence, but their memory can serve as a call to action for all of us to work toward a world where such tragedies become increasingly rare. In the end, the execution of Byron Lewis Black in August 2025 brought legal closure to this case, but it cannot bring back the 3 lives he destroyed on that March night in 1988. The best tribute we can pay to Angela, LaToya, and Lakeisha is to learn from their story and work to prevent similar tragedies from occurring in the future. Justice may have been served in the legal sense, but the true victory will come when we create communities where women and children are safe from violence, where warning signs are recognized and acted upon, and where the cycle of violence is broken before it can claim more innocent lives. This is the story of the Clay family murders, a tragedy that reminds us of both the darkness that humans are capable of inflicting and the importance of protecting those who cannot protect themselves. May Angela, Latoya, and Lakeisha Clay rest in peace, and may their story inspire us to be better protectors of the vulnerable in our own communities. I'm just putting it out there. If you're still awake and listening, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from, the time in your part of the world, or just say something to let me know you're still with me. And of course, if you haven't already, like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story for sleep. Now, let's move on to our third story. Story 3. In the rolling countryside of Surrey, England, stands the magnificent Pennyhill Park Hotel. This five-star sanctuary has welcomed guests for over a century, its Victorian elegance and manicured gardens offering respite from the world's troubles. The hotel's reputation for luxury and discretion has made it a favorite among celebrities, dignitaries, and those seeking special celebrations. But in April of 2024, this haven of tranquility became the setting for a tragedy that would forever change the lives of those who knew Samantha Mickelberg. Samantha was 54 years old, a woman whose presence could light up any room she entered. Her family lovingly called her their champagne girl, effervescent, sparkling, full of life. As a mother of two, she had dedicated herself to nurturing and caring for others throughout her life. Friends described her as incredibly generous, someone who would go out of her way to ensure no one felt alone or forgotten. This compassionate nature, this inability to turn her back on someone in need, would ultimately lead her to make a decision that cost her everything. The story begins not with the crime itself, but with the complicated relationship that preceded it. Samantha had been in a romantic relationship with James Cartwright, a 60-year-old estate agent from the quaint town of Axminster in Devon. On the surface, Cartwright appeared successful and established. He was well educated, having attended Harrow School, one of England's most prestigious institutions. He had built a career in property, even serving as a director of a company called Surdham Property. His professional credentials were impressive enough that he had once served on an advisory panel for the Bank of England. But behind this polished exterior lay a man whose behavior would eventually reveal itself to be deeply troubling. Those close to Samantha began to notice changes in her demeanor during the relationship. She confided in friends that she found the relationship suffocating. Cartwright's attention, which might have seemed romantic at first, had become overwhelming and controlling. The boundaries that healthy relationships require were being eroded, bit by bit. As winter turned to spring in 2024, Samantha made the difficult decision to end the relationship. She had reached her breaking point, recognizing that what she had initially mistaken for devotion was actually something far more sinister. Cartwright had moved out of her house just a few weeks earlier, and she hoped this physical separation would help him understand that their romantic relationship was truly over. But Cartwright refused to accept this reality. Despite having moved in with a new partner, he continued to behave as though his relationship with Samantha could be salvaged. He persisted in reaching out, in trying to maintain the connection that she had decided to sever. This inability or unwillingness to respect her decision should have been a warning sign of what was to come. As Cartwright's 60th birthday approached in April, Samantha found herself facing a dilemma that spoke to her fundamental nature as a caring person. She knew he would be alone on this milestone birthday, and despite everything that had happened between them, she couldn't bear the thought of him spending such an important day in solitude. Against what might have been her better judgment, she made a decision rooted in compassion. She would celebrate his birthday with him one final time. This gesture was meant to be exactly that, final. Samantha confided in friends that she viewed this birthday celebration as closure, a last act of kindness before permanently closing this chapter of her life. She knew, with the certainty that comes from deep self-reflection, that this would be the last time she would see James Cartwright. The plan was straightforward enough. They would spend a weekend at the luxurious Penny Hill Park Hotel, celebrating his birthday in style. The hotel, with its world-renowned spa, Michelin-starred dining, and impeccable service, would provide an elegant setting for what Samantha intended as a farewell gift. She made the reservation, arranged the details, and prepared for what she hoped would be a peaceful conclusion to a relationship that had become increasingly difficult. On April 12, 2024, Samantha and Cartwright arrived at Penny Hill Park Hotel. The Grand Victorian building, set among perfectly manicured gardens, welcomed them with the sort of understated luxury that the hotel was famous for. Their room was beautifully appointed, overlooking the grounds where peacocks roamed freely and ancient trees provided shade for afternoon tea. It was the kind of setting where one might expect only pleasant memories to be made. For the first part of their stay, things seemed to proceed according to Samantha's plan. They settled into their room, explored the hotel's amenities, and began what was meant to be a civilized birthday celebration. The hotel staff, trained to provide impeccable service while maintaining discretion, noticed nothing unusual about the couple during these initial hours. But beneath the surface, tensions were building. Cartwright, despite the generous gesture Samantha had made in organizing this celebration, remained unable to accept the reality of their situation. In his mind, perhaps this romantic getaway represented not an ending, but a new beginning. The fundamental disconnect between Samantha's intentions and his expectations created an undercurrent of conflict that would soon surface in the most tragic way imaginable. On the evening of April 13, the couple made their way to one of the hotel's elegant dining rooms for dinner. The restaurant, with its soft lighting and carefully curated atmosphere, provided the perfect setting for intimate conversation. Other guests enjoyed their meals, the gentle murmur of conversation and the soft clink of crystal and silverware creating the sort of ambience that Penny Hill Park was renowned for. But during this dinner, Samantha began to feel unwell. The exact nature of her discomfort isn't entirely clear from the records, but it was significant enough that she and Cartwright decided to cut their evening short and return to their room. This departure from the restaurant would be one of the last times anyone outside their hotel room would see Samantha Mickelberg alive. What happened next can only be reconstructed from forensic evidence, witness testimony, and Cartwright's own account, though his version of events would prove to be, in the words of prosecutors, part of a web of lies designed to conceal the horrific reality of what occurred in that hotel room. According to the evidence presented at trial, sometime in the early morning hours of April 14, James Cartwright subjected Samantha to a brutal sexual assault. The forensic evidence would later reveal the violent nature of this attack, painting a picture of a woman who fought desperately against her attacker. But Samantha, despite her courage and resistance, was overpowered by a man whose rage had finally been unleashed. The sexual assault was not the end of Samantha's ordeal. In what can only be described as an escalation of violence that defies comprehension, Cartwright then murdered her. The forensic evidence told a story of sustained brutality, of a life being taken not in a moment of passion or sudden rage, but through deliberate and prolonged violence. When hotel staff discovered Samantha's body later that morning, they found her in the hotel room that had been meant for celebration. The scene that greeted them was one that would haunt those who witnessed it for the rest of their lives. This room, which should have held only memories of a final, kind gesture between former lovers, had instead become the site of unspeakable violence. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of this crime was not the violence itself, but Cartwright's behavior in its aftermath. Rather than showing remorse, panic, or any of the emotions one might expect from someone who had just committed such a heinous act, he displayed a cold calculation that spoke to a complete absence of conscience. When emergency services arrived at the hotel, they found Cartwright in the room with Samantha's body. His demeanor was described as unnaturally calm for someone who had supposedly just discovered his former partner dead. He initially claimed that Samantha had suffered a nosebleed, and that he had attempted to help her by pinching her nose to stop the bleeding. He told paramedics that no first aid was required, a statement that would later strike investigators as particularly callous given the obvious severity of Samantha's injuries. Even more disturbing was witness testimony about Cartwright's behavior as emergency responders worked at the scene. According to witnesses, as the ambulance prepared to leave the hotel with Samantha's body, Cartwright was seen waving goodbye. This gesture, so inappropriate and disconnected from the gravity of the situation, provided a glimpse into the mind of a man who seemed incapable of processing the horror of what he had done. The investigation that followed was thorough and methodical. Surrey Police, working alongside forensic experts and the Crown Prosecution Service, began building a case that would ultimately bring James Cartwright to justice. The forensic evidence was overwhelming, painting a clear picture of what had occurred in that hotel room. The pattern of injuries on Samantha's body told a story that contradicted every aspect of Cartwright's initial claims. As investigators delved deeper into Cartwright's background and his relationship with Samantha, a disturbing pattern emerged. Friends and family members came forward to describe behavior that, in retrospect, showed clear signs of the controlling and coercive conduct that prosecutors would later charge him with. The relationship that Samantha had found suffocating was revealed to be part of a systematic pattern of psychological manipulation and control. The legal process moved forward with the deliberate pace that serious criminal cases require. Cartwright was arrested on April 14, the same day Samantha's body was discovered. He was charged not only with murder, but also with rape and controlling and coercive behavior. The multiple charges reflected the comprehensive nature of the crime and the pattern of abuse that had preceded it. As the case progressed through the court system, Cartwright secured legal representation and prepared what would become his defense strategy. Rather than accepting responsibility for his actions, he chose to maintain his innocence and force Samantha's family and friends to endure the trauma of a full trial. The trial began in November 2024 at Guildford Crown Court, a modern courthouse that has handled some of Surrey's most serious criminal cases. The courtroom became a place where Samantha's life and death would be examined in excruciating detail, where evidence would be presented that would paint the most complete picture possible of the horrific events at Pennyhill Park Hotel. The prosecution, led by Senior Crown Prosecutor Moses Koroma from CPS Southeast, methodically presented their case. They called expert witnesses who testified about the forensic evidence, medical professionals who explained the nature of Samantha's injuries, and investigators who described the scene they found at the hotel. Each piece of testimony added to a comprehensive picture of premeditated violence and calculated deception. Perhaps most powerfully, the prosecution presented testimony from Samantha's friends and family members. They described the vibrant, caring woman they had known and loved, the champagne girl, who lit up every room she entered. They spoke about her generosity, her devotion to her children, and her fundamental kindness. The contrast between this portrait of Samantha and the violence that had been inflicted upon her was stark and heartbreaking. The defense strategy centered around Cartwright's claim that Samantha's death had been accidental. Taking the witness stand in his own defense, he maintained that she had died after falling out of bed. This explanation, which flew in the face of all forensic evidence, represented what prosecutors called his continued web of lies. The defense attempted to portray the events as a tragic accident, suggesting that any injury Samantha had sustained were the result of an unfortunate fall rather than deliberate violence. They asked the jury to consider whether the prosecution had proven beyond a reasonable doubt that Cartwright had intended to kill Samantha. But the evidence against Cartwright was overwhelming. The forensic analysis of the crime scene, the pattern of injuries on Samantha's body, and the medical examiner's testimony all pointed to the same conclusion: this was not an accident, but a deliberate act of extreme violence. The prosecution's expert witnesses explained to the jury exactly why Cartwright's explanation was medically and forensically impossible. Perhaps most damaging to the defense was Cartwright's own behavior both before and after the crime. The evidence of controlling and coercive behavior in the relationship, his inability to accept that the relationship was over, and his calculated response to the discovery of Samantha's body all painted a picture of a man capable of the violence he was accused of. The trial proceeded with the careful attention to detail that such serious charges require. Every aspect of the evidence was examined, every witness was thoroughly questioned, and every possible alternative explanation was considered. The jury, composed of 12 ordinary citizens who had been asked to sit in judgment of one of the most serious crimes in the legal system, listened carefully to weeks of testimony. When the time came for closing arguments, the prosecution summarized their case with clarity and force. They reminded the jury of the overwhelming evidence against Cartwright, the impossibility of his alternative explanation, and the pattern of behavior that had led to this tragic conclusion. They asked the jury to find him guilty on all charges, to hold him accountable for the full scope of his crimes against Samantha. The defense made their final appeal for their client, asking the jury to consider whether the prosecution had truly proven guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. They urged the jurors to consider the possibility, however remote, that this had been a tragic accident rather than a deliberate crime. When both sides had presented their cases, the judge provided detailed instructions to the jury about the law, the charges, and their responsibilities as jurors. The 12 citizens retired to consider their verdict, carrying with them the weight of determining justice for Samantha Mickelberg. The deliberation process, which can sometimes take days or even weeks in complex cases, was remarkably swift. After just one afternoon of discussion, the jury reached their unanimous verdict. When they returned to the courtroom, the tension was palpable as everyone, the prosecution, the defense, Samantha's family, and the press, waited to hear their decision. The foreman of the jury stood and delivered the verdict that would finally bring legal closure to this tragic case: guilty of murder. Guilty of rape. Not guilty of controlling and coercive behavior. While the jury had not convicted Cartwright on all charges, they had found him guilty of the most serious offenses, the violent crimes that had ended Samantha's life. The moment the verdict was read, Samantha's loved ones in the courtroom were overcome with emotion. The relief, the grief, and the satisfaction that justice had been served all combined in a moment of overwhelming feeling. They embraced each other, tears flowing freely as they processed the fact that Cartwright would finally be held accountable for what he had done to their beloved Samantha. The conviction phase of the trial was complete, but one crucial step remained: sentencing. In the British legal system, the judge has discretion in determining the appropriate punishment within the guidelines established by law. For murder, the sentence is always life imprisonment, but the judge must decide the minimum term that must be served before the possibility of parole can be considered. The sentencing hearing took place on August 8, 2025, nearly 16 months after Samantha's death. Guildford Crown Court was again filled with family members, legal professionals, and members of the press as Mr. Justice Murray prepared to impose sentence on James Cartwright. Before announcing the sentence, the judge addressed the court about the nature of the crime and Cartwright's actions. He spoke about the betrayal of trust involved when someone murders their former partner, the particularly heinous nature of the sexual assault that preceded the murder, and the calculated way in which Cartwright had attempted to cover up his crimes. The judge also acknowledged the impact of the crime on Samantha's family and friends, the loss of a beloved mother, daughter, and friend who had been taken from them in such a violent and senseless way. He recognized that no sentence, however severe, could truly compensate for their loss or bring back the woman they loved. When Mr. Justice Murray announced the sentence, it reflected the severity of Cartwright's crimes: life imprisonment with a minimum term of 28 years for murder, and 9 years for rape, to run concurrently. This meant that Cartwright, now 61 years old, would be at least 89 before he could even be considered for parole. The judge's words as he imposed sentence were particularly pointed. He described Cartwright's actions as evil and noted the calculating nature of his crimes and his subsequent attempts to deceive investigators. The 28-year minimum term was among the longer sentences for murder, reflecting the judge's assessment of the particularly serious nature of this case. With the sentence imposed, James Cartwright was led away to begin his life sentence. For the first time since April 14, 2024, he was no longer free to harm anyone else. The legal system had done what it could to provide justice for Samantha Mickelberg and accountability for her killer. After the sentencing, Samantha's family released a statement that spoke to their relief that Cartwright was no longer free to harm women. They expressed gratitude to the police, prosecutors, and all those who had worked to bring him to justice, while also acknowledging that no legal outcome could fill the void left by Samantha's absence from their lives. The Crown Prosecution Service also released a statement emphasizing the thoroughness of their case and their satisfaction with the verdict. Senior Crown Prosecutor Moses Koroma noted that, it was clear from the forensic evidence that Samantha Mickelberg had been subjected to a sustained and brutal attack. The statement served as a reminder that despite Cartwright's attempts to deceive investigators and the jury with his alternative explanation, the truth had ultimately prevailed. As news of the sentence spread, it served as a sobering reminder of the dangers that can lurk beneath seemingly normal relationships. Samantha's story became part of the broader conversation about domestic violence, coercive control, and the particular vulnerability that can arise when someone tries to end an unhealthy relationship. The case also highlighted the importance of trusting one's instincts about relationships that feel wrong. Samantha had recognized that her relationship with Cartwright was suffocating and had taken the difficult step of ending it. Her decision to celebrate his birthday one final time, while born from kindness and compassion, inadvertently placed her in harm's way. But perhaps the most important lesson from this tragic case is about the nature of true kindness and generosity. Samantha Mickelberg was remembered by all who knew her as someone who couldn't bear the thought of others being alone or unhappy. This fundamental goodness, this inability to turn her back on someone in need, was both her greatest strength and, ultimately, what led to her death. Her family's description of her as their champagne girl, who lit up every room, speaks to the kind of person the world lost on that April morning at Penny Hill Park Hotel. She was someone who brought joy and light wherever she went, someone whose presence made others feel happier and more alive. The luxurious hotel where these events took place has undoubtedly been changed by what happened within its walls. Penny Hill Park, which had built its reputation on providing a sanctuary from the world's troubles, had instead become the setting for an unthinkable tragedy. The staff who discovered Samantha's body, the guests who were staying there that weekend, and the hotel itself all became part of a story that none of them could have imagined. In the months following the trial and sentencing, life slowly began to return to some semblance of normalcy for those who had been touched by this case. The investigators returned to other cases, the prosecutors moved on to other trials, and the hotel continued to welcome guests seeking luxury and tranquility. But for Samantha's family and friends, the healing process will continue for years to come. They must find ways to honor her memory while processing the trauma of how her life ended. They must celebrate the joy she brought to their lives while grappling with the senseless violence that took her away from them. The case of Samantha Mickelberg serves as a stark reminder that evil can wear the mask of respectability, that violence can erupt from seemingly civilized circumstances, and that the most dangerous time for someone in an abusive relationship is often when they try to leave. It also reminds us of the value of compassion and kindness, even as it shows how those very qualities can sometimes leave us vulnerable to those who would exploit them. Samantha's decision to ensure that Cartwright wouldn't spend his birthday alone was an act of pure generosity, one that cost her everything. As this story draws to a close, it's worth reflecting on the life that was lost and the impact that one person's kindness can have on the world. Samantha Mickelberg was a mother who loved her children, a friend who couldn't bear to see others suffer, and a woman who tried to end a relationship with grace and compassion. Her story has now become part of the legal record, a case that will be studied and referenced by lawyers, judges, and law enforcement professionals for years to come. But more than that, it has become a reminder of the preciousness of life and the importance of protecting those who are vulnerable. The five-star luxury of Penny Hill Park Hotel, the manicured gardens and impeccable service, could not protect Samantha from the man who claimed to care for her but instead destroyed her. The beautiful setting became a backdrop for tragedy, a reminder that evil can intrude into even the most peaceful and elegant of places. James Cartwright, the Harrow-educated estate agent who once advised the Bank of England, revealed himself to be capable of the most brutal and senseless violence. His respectable facade concealed a man who could not accept rejection, who believed that his desires superseded another person's right to safety and autonomy. The 28-year minimum sentence he received ensures that he will spend the remainder of his productive years in prison, separated from society and unable to harm anyone else. It is a fitting punishment for someone who betrayed the trust of a woman who had once cared for him, who repaid her final act of kindness with the ultimate cruelty. And so the story ends, not with justice restored, for true justice would require Samantha to still be alive, but with accountability achieved and a dangerous man removed from society. Her family can take some comfort in knowing that her killer will face consequences for his actions, even as they continue to mourn the vibrant woman they lost. In the quiet moments, when the legal proceedings have ended and the media attention has moved on to other stories, the memory of Samantha Mickelberg lives on. She lives on in her children, who carry forward her legacy of kindness and compassion. She lives on in her friends, who remember her laughter and her generous spirit. She lives on in the lessons her story teaches about the importance of recognizing and escaping from toxic relationships before it's too late. The champagne girl who lit up every room has been silenced, but the light she brought to the world continues to shine in the lives of those who loved her and in the memory of all who hear her story. And perhaps that is the most fitting tribute to a life that was taken too soon, that her story continues to be told, her memory continues to be honored, and her legacy of kindness continues to inspire others to treat each person they encounter with dignity, respect, and care. This has been the story of Samantha Mickelberg, a woman whose final act of kindness cost her everything, and whose memory serves as a reminder of both the beauty and the fragility of human life. May she rest in peace, and may her story serve as a warning and an inspiration to all who hear it. Please, if you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe, so you don't miss the next true crime story for sleep. Now, let's move on to our fourth story. Story 4. Tonight, we journey to the quiet countryside of Suffolk, England, where the peaceful village of Brantham became the scene of an unthinkable tragedy. This is the story of Anita Rose, a devoted mother and grandmother whose morning walk with her beloved dog would become her last. Anita Rose was 57 years old in the summer of 2024, a woman whose life was defined by love, dedication, and quiet strength. She was a mother to 6 children, each one a testament to her nurturing spirit, and a grandmother who found joy in the laughter and energy of her grandchildren. Those who knew Anita described her as someone who put family first, always ready with a warm meal, a listening ear, or a helping hand. In the small village of Brantham, nestled in the heart of Suffolk's countryside, Anita had built a life of simple pleasures. The village itself was the kind of place where neighbors knew each other by name, where children could play safely in the streets, and where the most pressing concern might be whether the village cricket match would be rained out on Sunday afternoon. It was a community where trust was implicit, where doors remained unlocked, and where a woman could walk her dog in the early morning hours without fear. Brantham sits quietly along the River Stour, its Tudor cottages and Georgian houses creating a picture postcard scene that has remained largely unchanged for centuries. The village church, with its ancient stones and peaceful cemetery, stands as a silent witness to generations of families who have called this place home. Tree-lined lanes wind through the countryside, connecting Brantham to neighboring villages and creating a network of footpaths that locals have used for decades as safe routes for walking, jogging, and dog exercise. For Anita, these morning walks represented more than just exercise. They were moments of peace in what was surely a busy life managing a large family. She had a routine, as many dog owners do, rising early to take advantage of the cool morning air and the quiet that comes before the world fully awakens. Her companion on these walks was Bruce, an English Springer Spaniel whose boundless energy and loyal nature made him the perfect walking partner. English Springer Spaniels are known for their intelligence and eagerness to please, traits that would have made Bruce not just a pet, but a true member of the Rose family. These dogs form strong bonds with their owners, and it's easy to imagine the relationship between Anita and Bruce as one built on mutual affection and daily ritual. The morning walk was their time together, a chance for Bruce to explore the familiar scents and sounds of the countryside while Anita enjoyed the therapeutic rhythm of walking and the peaceful solitude of early morning. On the morning of July 24, 2024, Anita followed her usual routine. She rose early, perhaps brewing a quick cup of tea while Bruce waited patiently by the door, his tail wagging in anticipation of their daily adventure. The summer morning would have been pleasant, not yet touched by the heat that would come later in the day. She gathered Bruce's lead, made sure she had her mobile phone, and stepped out into what should have been another ordinary, peaceful morning in Brantham. The route she chose was familiar, a path she had likely walked hundreds of times before. It led away from the main village streets, winding through the countryside to a track near the local sewage works. While that might sound unpleasant, these utility areas in rural England are often surrounded by open fields and footpaths that provide perfect walking routes away from traffic. The path was quiet, safe, and offered the kind of peaceful environment that makes early morning walks so restorative. What Anita couldn't have known as she set out that morning was that her routine had been observed. Somewhere in the shadows of rural Suffolk, a man named Roy Barkley had been living on the margins of society, avoiding the law and the normal constraints of civilized life. At 56 years old, Barkley was a man who had already demonstrated his unwillingness to follow society's rules, someone whose presence in the peaceful countryside would prove to be as dangerous as it was unwelcome. Roy Barkley's story is one of a man who had consistently chosen to place himself outside the boundaries of law and order. At 56, he was no stranger to the criminal justice system, having accumulated a history that would eventually lead to his recall to prison for offenses that the courts had deemed serious enough to warrant his return to custody. But Barkley had other plans. Rather than face the consequences of his actions, he chose instead to disappear, to live what some might romantically call an off-grid lifestyle, but which was in reality a calculated attempt to avoid accountability. For 2 years, Barkley had been living as a fugitive, moving through the countryside of England like a shadow, avoiding detection while the authorities searched for him. This wasn't the romantic notion of a man seeking to live simply and peacefully away from modern society's complexities. This was a man actively evading justice, someone whose very presence in any community represented an unknown danger to law-abiding citizens. Living off-grid as a wanted man requires a particular set of skills and mindset. It means finding shelter wherever possible, perhaps in abandoned buildings, woodland areas, or temporary accommodations that don't require identification or official registration. It means scavenging for food, finding ways to stay warm and dry, and constantly remaining alert to the possibility of discovery. For someone like Barkley, it also meant living with the constant tension of knowing that capture was inevitable, that eventually his luck would run out and he would face the justice he had been avoiding. The psychological profile of someone willing to live this way for 2 years reveals important characteristics. There's a deep-seated resistance to authority, an unwillingness to accept responsibility for one's actions, and often an increasing desperation as the walls of law enforcement close in. People in this situation can become increasingly unstable, more prone to poor decision-making, and more dangerous to anyone they might encounter. What makes Barkley's story particularly troubling is that during those 2 years of avoiding capture, he was essentially invisible to the communities through which he moved. The residents of places like Brantham had no way of knowing that a wanted man was in their midst, someone whose presence represented a threat to their safety and that of their families. The very nature of rural communities, with their trust and openness, made them vulnerable to someone who was operating outside all social norms. Barkley had become, in essence, a predator moving through the countryside undetected. Whether he had committed other crimes during those 2 years remains unknown, but his ability to avoid capture suggests someone who had become skilled at observation, at understanding patterns and routines, at identifying vulnerabilities. These are not skills that develop in isolation, they suggest someone who had been watching, learning, and possibly planning. The tragedy of Anita Rose's story is that it represents the moment when Barkley's fugitive existence collided with an innocent life. After 2 years of successfully avoiding capture, something changed on the morning of July 24, 2024. Whether it was desperation, opportunity, or simply the culmination of mounting psychological pressure, Barkley made a decision that would transform him from a fugitive avoiding justice into a murderer whose actions would shock an entire nation. The early hours of July 24, 2024, began like countless others in the Rose household. Anita woke before dawn, perhaps around 5 a.m., following the routine that had become second nature to her and Bruce. The house would have been quiet, her family still sleeping as she moved through the familiar morning preparation. Bruce, as dogs do, would have sensed the approaching walk time and begun his own routine of anticipation and excitement. The summer morning air in Suffolk would have carried the fresh scent of countryside, that clean smell of grass heavy with dew and the earthy richness of agricultural land. The sky would have been lightening but not yet fully bright, creating that peaceful twilight that early risers know and treasure. It was the perfect time for a quiet walk, a time when the countryside belonged to dog walkers, joggers, and the few early workers beginning their day. Anita attached Bruce's lead and stepped out of her home, beginning what should have been another routine journey through the familiar paths of Brantham. The route to the footpath near the sewage works was one she had taken many times, a safe and quiet track that allowed Bruce to explore and exercise while keeping them both away from traffic and the bustle of village life. It was exactly the kind of peaceful morning activity that makes rural living so appealing to families seeking a quieter pace of life. The path itself wound through typical Suffolk countryside, past fields and hedgerows that had defined this landscape for centuries. Ancient footpaths like these are rights of way that have been used by generations of local residents, creating a network of safe walking routes that connect villages and provide access to the countryside. For someone like Anita, these paths represented freedom, exercise, and a daily dose of the natural world that helps maintain both physical and mental health. As Anita and Bruce made their way along the familiar track, neither could have sensed the danger that awaited them. Somewhere ahead, Roy Barkley was present, whether by coincidence or because he had been observing the routines of local residents. The exact circumstances of how their paths crossed may never be fully known, but what happened next would transform a peaceful morning walk into a scene of unimaginable violence. Bruce, being a loyal and protective breed, would have sensed danger before Anita. Springer Spaniels are naturally alert dogs, quick to notice anything unusual in their environment. It's likely that Bruce's behavior changed as they approached whatever situation was developing, perhaps growing tense or alert in the way that dogs do when they perceive a threat to their beloved owners. What followed was an attack of such brutality that it defied comprehension. Roy Barkley, for reasons that may never be fully understood, launched into a vicious assault on Anita Rose. The details are difficult to relate, even in the gentle tones appropriate for a bedtime story, because they speak to a level of violence that seems almost incomprehensible when contrasted with the peaceful setting and the innocent nature of Anita's morning routine. Barkley subjected Anita to what prosecutors would later describe as numerous kicks, stamps, and blows. The force and severity of the attack were such that her injuries would later be compared to those typically seen in high-speed car crashes. This was not a brief altercation or a robbery gone wrong. This was a sustained and brutal assault on a woman who posed no threat and who had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. During this horrific attack, Bruce would have been present, likely attempting to protect his owner in whatever way a dog could manage. The scene that investigators would later discover showed Bruce's lead wrapped tightly around Anita's leg, a detail that speaks to the chaos and violence of those terrible moments. Whether Bruce was attempting to help Anita or was himself caught up in the violence, the image of this loyal dog entangled with his grievously injured owner adds another layer of tragedy to an already heartbreaking story. When Barkley's assault finally ended, he left Anita for dead on the footpath. But his actions weren't finished. In a move that would later prove crucial to the investigation, he took items from Anita's person, her mobile phone and the distinctive pink jacket she had been wearing. These weren't items of significant monetary value, but they would become important evidence in the case against him, and their theft suggests motivations that went beyond simple robbery. As the morning progressed and the sun rose higher over the Suffolk countryside, the peaceful village of Brantham was about to be forever changed by a discovery that would shock the community to its core. At approximately 6:25 a.m., less than an hour and a half after Anita had left her home for what should have been a routine walk, a cyclist traveling along the footpath made a discovery that would haunt them forever. There, lying face down on the track near the sewage works, was Anita Rose, unconscious and grievously injured, with Bruce still nearby, his lead tangled around her leg. The cyclist, faced with this horrific scene, immediately called for emergency assistance, setting in motion a chain of events that would mobilize police, paramedics, and eventually a major murder investigation. The first responders arrived to find Anita clinging to life but with injuries so severe that her survival seemed unlikely. The paramedics, trained to deal with medical emergencies, would have been struck by the extent and nature of her injuries. These were not the result of an accidental fall or a medical episode, they were clearly the result of a sustained and violent attack. The fact that she was found with her dog's lead wrapped around her leg added another disturbing element to an already tragic scene. Anita was rushed to Addenbrooke's Hospital in Cambridge, one of the region's leading medical facilities, where doctors and nurses fought desperately to save her life. For 4 days, she remained in critical condition while medical staff used every tool at their disposal to try to overcome the massive trauma her body had sustained. Her family gathered at her bedside, holding vigil and praying for a miracle that would never come. During those 4 agonizing days, Suffolk police launched what would become one of the most intensive murder investigations in the county's recent history. Detective teams cordoned off the crime scene, preserving every piece of evidence that might lead them to Anita's attacker. The footpath where she had been found became the center of a meticulous forensic investigation, with specialists examining every inch of ground for clues that might identify her assailant. The initial investigation revealed several important facts. Anita's mobile phone was missing, as was the distinctive cerise pink Regatta Calderdale II jacket she had been wearing when she left home. These missing items immediately suggested that robbery might have been a motive, but the extreme nature of the violence pointed to something much more sinister. The investigators also noted that this appeared to be a random attack, with no evidence that Anita had known her attacker or that she had been specifically targeted. The description of the missing items was released to the public, along with appeals for anyone who might have seen anything suspicious in the area that morning. The pink jacket, in particular, was distinctive enough that investigators hoped someone might remember seeing it or finding it discarded somewhere in the countryside. Similarly, Anita's phone, with its black wallet-style case decorated with gold crown and stud details, was unique enough that it might be recognizable if discovered. On July 28, 2024, 4 days after the attack, Anita Rose succumbed to her injuries and died in the hospital, surrounded by her grieving family. The investigation immediately shifted from attempted murder to homicide, raising the stakes and intensifying the urgency to find her killer. The loss of this beloved mother and grandmother sent shockwaves through not just Brantham, but the entire region, as people struggled to understand how such violence could occur in their peaceful rural community. The investigation team, led by experienced detectives from Suffolk Police, began the painstaking work of building a case from the evidence available at the crime scene and the few clues they had to work with. They conducted extensive interviews with local residents, seeking anyone who might have seen something unusual that morning or in the days leading up to the attack. They also began the process of analyzing any forensic evidence recovered from the scene, hoping that modern investigative techniques might provide the breakthrough they needed. One of the most challenging aspects of the investigation was the apparent randomness of the crime. Random attacks are often the most difficult to solve because there are no obvious connections between victim and perpetrator, no history of conflict or dispute that might point investigators in the right direction. The fact that Anita was simply going about her daily routine when she was attacked meant that detectives had to cast a much wider net in their search for suspects. As news of Anita Rose's murder spread throughout Suffolk and beyond, the investigation took on an urgency that reflected both the heinous nature of the crime and the community's desperate need for answers. Suffolk Police assembled a major incident team, bringing together some of their most experienced detectives and forensic specialists to work on what had become one of the county's most serious criminal cases. The investigation team faced several significant challenges from the outset. The crime scene, while preserved and thoroughly examined, had yielded limited physical evidence pointing to a specific perpetrator. The rural location meant there were few witnesses who might have observed anything suspicious, and the early morning timing meant that even fewer people were around who might have seen the attack or noticed someone fleeing the scene. However, the investigators did have some important leads to follow. The missing items from Anita's person, particularly her distinctive pink jacket and mobile phone, represented potential evidence that might surface during the investigation. The team also began the process of examining any CCTV footage from the surrounding area, though the rural nature of Brantham meant that surveillance cameras were far less common than they would be in urban areas. The forensic examination of the crime scene continued for several days, with specialists collecting every possible piece of physical evidence that might later prove crucial in court. This included soil samples, fabric fibers, and any other trace evidence that might connect a suspect to the location where Anita was attacked. Modern forensic techniques can extract usable DNA evidence from the smallest samples, and investigators were hopeful that something from the scene might provide the breakthrough they needed. Public appeals became a crucial part of the investigation strategy. Suffolk police released detailed descriptions of the missing items and asked anyone who might have found them to come forward. They also appealed for witnesses who might have been in the area on the morning of July 24, even if they didn't think they had seen anything significant. Often in criminal investigations, seemingly minor details can prove crucial when viewed as part of the larger picture. The case attracted significant media attention, both locally and nationally. The combination of an apparently random attack on an innocent woman during her morning dog walk struck a chord with people across the country, many of whom could identify with Anita's routine and recognize how easily they could find themselves in a similar situation. The media coverage helped keep the case in the public eye and generated numerous tips and potential leads for investigators to pursue. Several weeks into the investigation, detectives received information that would prove to be the breakthrough they had been seeking. Through a combination of forensic evidence and investigative work, they identified Roy Barkley as a person of interest in Anita's murder. The fact that Barkley was already wanted on recall to prison made him an immediate priority for apprehension, but his fugitive status meant that locating him would be another significant challenge. The discovery that their suspect had been living off-grid for 2 years added complexity to the investigation. Barkley had proven himself capable of avoiding detection for an extended period, suggesting that he was both resourceful and determined to avoid capture. The investigation team had to consider the possibility that he might have already fled the area, making their task even more difficult. However, investigators had one crucial advantage in their search for Barkley: they now knew what they were looking for. With his identity established as a prime suspect, they could focus their resources on tracking his movements and identifying possible locations where he might be hiding. This represented a significant shift from the earlier phases of the investigation, when they had been working with limited information about who might have committed this terrible crime. The hunt for Roy Barkley became a priority not just for Suffolk police, but for law enforcement agencies across the region. His fugitive status and the serious nature of the murder charge meant that considerable resources were dedicated to his capture. The investigation team worked around the clock, following up leads and coordinating with other agencies to ensure that when Barkley was located, he could be apprehended quickly and safely. The breakthrough in the Anita Rose murder investigation came through a combination of traditional detective work and modern forensic science. As investigators pieced together evidence from the crime scene and followed up on leads generated by their public appeals, a picture began to emerge that pointed clearly toward Roy Barkley as the perpetrator of this heinous crime. The arrest, when it finally came, was the culmination of weeks of intensive investigation work. Barkley's 2-year run from justice came to an end when law enforcement officers, acting on information developed during the murder investigation, located and apprehended him. The moment of capture must have been both satisfying for the officers involved and deeply significant for Anita's family, who had been waiting for answers about who had taken their loved one from them. Once in custody, Barkley became the subject of intensive questioning about his whereabouts and actions on the morning of July 24, 2024. The investigators now had the opportunity to confront him with the evidence they had gathered and to seek answers about what had motivated such a brutal attack on an innocent woman. However, as often happens in serious criminal cases, Barkley was not immediately forthcoming with information about his involvement in Anita's murder. One of the most significant pieces of evidence against Barkley came from an unexpected source: his own digital footprint. Despite living off-grid and avoiding official detection for 2 years, Barkley had apparently maintained some access to digital technology. Investigators discovered that after the attack on Anita, he had used a mobile device to search for information about police investigative techniques, suggesting that he was aware he might be under suspicion and was trying to understand how authorities might be tracking him. Even more damaging was evidence that Barkley had researched how to dispose of evidence, including searches related to getting rid of items that might connect him to a crime. This digital evidence proved crucial in establishing not just his involvement in the attack, but also his awareness of guilt and his attempts to avoid detection. The irony that his efforts to evade capture actually provided evidence of his guilt was not lost on investigators. Perhaps most significantly, investigators discovered that Barkley had kept items belonging to Anita Rose. The prosecution would later argue that these items were kept as trophies from his attack, a behavior pattern often seen in cases involving sexual or sadistic motivation. The fact that he had retained these items rather than simply discarding them provided powerful evidence of his involvement and suggested disturbing psychological motivations behind the attack. The items recovered from Barkley's possession included Anita's missing mobile phone and elements of her distinctive pink jacket. These physical pieces of evidence provided a direct link between Barkley and the crime scene, making it impossible for him to deny his involvement in the attack. The condition and location of these items also provided investigators with additional information about Barkley's movements and actions after the murder. As the investigation continued and more evidence was gathered, a clearer picture emerged of what had happened on that tragic morning in July. The attack appeared to have been random, with Anita simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time when she encountered Barkley during her routine dog walk. There was no evidence that she had known her attacker or that there was any history between them. She had simply become the victim of a violent man who was already outside the bounds of civilized society. The forensic evidence from the crime scene, combined with the items found in Barkley's possession and his digital searches after the attack, built a compelling case for his prosecution. However, investigators continued to work diligently to ensure that every piece of evidence was properly documented and preserved, knowing that Anita's family deserved nothing less than a thorough and professional investigation that would hold her killer accountable. The arrest of Roy Barkley provided some measure of relief to the Brantham community, which had been living with the knowledge that a murderer had been among them. However, it also raised disturbing questions about how a wanted fugitive had been able to operate undetected in their midst for so long, and whether anything could have been done to prevent this tragedy. The legal proceedings against Roy Barkley began with his formal charging for the murder of Anita Rose. The Crown Prosecution Service, reviewing the extensive evidence gathered by Suffolk Police, determined that they had a strong case against Barkley and proceeded with prosecution for murder in the first degree. The severity of the charges reflected both the brutal nature of the attack and the evidence suggesting premeditation and intent. Barkley's case was heard at Ipswich Crown Court, a venue that has seen many significant criminal trials over the years but few as shocking as this one. The courtroom proceedings would provide Anita's family with their first opportunity to see the man who had taken their loved one from them, and to hear the full details of what had happened on that tragic morning in July. The prosecution's case was methodical and comprehensive, built around 3 main pillars of evidence: the forensic evidence from the crime scene, the items found in Barkley's possession that belonged to Anita, and his own digital searches that demonstrated consciousness of guilt. Each piece of evidence was presented carefully, with expert witnesses explaining the significance of forensic findings and digital investigators detailing the timeline of Barkley's online activities after the murder. The trial revealed disturbing details about the extent of violence that Anita had suffered. Medical experts testified about her injuries, describing them as consistent with a sustained and brutal assault involving multiple kicks, stamps, and blows. The comparison of her injuries to those typically seen in high-speed car crashes helped the jury understand the tremendous force that Barkley had used in his attack on this innocent woman. One of the most emotionally difficult aspects of the trial was testimony about the scene where Anita was found, with Bruce's lead wrapped around her leg. This detail, while seemingly minor, spoke volumes about the chaos and terror of those final moments, and about the loyalty of a dog who had remained with his owner even in the face of such violence. For many observers, this image became symbolic of the senseless nature of the crime and the innocence of its victim. The prosecution also presented evidence about Barkley's attempts to conceal his involvement in the crime. His digital searches for information about police investigative techniques and evidence disposal methods demonstrated that he was fully aware of the gravity of what he had done and was actively trying to avoid capture. This evidence contradicted any potential defense based on mental illness or lack of awareness of his actions. Perhaps most damning was the evidence that Barkley had kept items belonging to Anita as what prosecutors described as trophies. This behavior pattern, while disturbing to contemplate, is unfortunately common in certain types of violent crimes and suggests a level of psychological disturbance that goes beyond the act of murder itself. The fact that he had retained these items rather than disposing of them provided powerful evidence of both his guilt and his disturbing motivations. Throughout the trial proceedings, Anita's family maintained a dignified presence in the courtroom, attending sessions to ensure that their loved one was properly represented and that justice was served. Their strength during this difficult period was noted by many observers, who recognized the tremendous emotional toll that listening to details about Anita's final moments must have taken on those who loved her most. The defense team faced the challenging task of representing a client whose guilt seemed overwhelming based on the evidence presented. While every defendant deserves competent representation, the strength of the prosecution's case made it difficult to mount an effective defense that might have resulted in acquittal or even a reduction in charges. On July 9, 2025, after deliberating on the evidence presented during the trial, the jury returned a verdict of guilty on the charge of murder. The conviction represented the culmination of nearly a year of investigation, prosecution, and legal proceedings, and provided a measure of justice for Anita Rose and her family. However, as is always the case in such circumstances, no verdict could truly compensate for the loss of a beloved mother and grandmother whose life was cut short by senseless violence. Following Roy Barkley's conviction for the murder of Anita Rose, the court moved to the sentencing phase of the proceedings. This part of the legal process provides an opportunity for the victim's family to make impact statements describing how the crime has affected their lives, and for the judge to consider all relevant factors before determining an appropriate punishment. The sentencing hearing at Ipswich Crown Court was attended by members of Anita's family, who had the opportunity to address the court about the impact of their loss. These victim impact statements, while deeply personal and often emotional, serve an important function in the justice system by ensuring that the human cost of crime is fully understood and considered. For Anita's 6 children and her grandchildren, this was their chance to tell the court about the woman they had lost and the void her death had created in their lives. The statements likely described Anita as more than just a victim of crime, but as a central figure in a large family who had depended on her love, support, and guidance. They would have spoken about missed birthdays and holidays, about grandchildren who would grow up without her presence, and about the daily reminders of her absence that would continue for the rest of their lives. These personal testimonies help transform legal proceedings from abstract discussions of law and evidence into recognition of real human tragedy. Judge Mr. Justice Lavender, presiding over the sentencing, had the responsibility of determining a punishment that reflected both the severity of the crime and the need for justice. In cases of murder in England, the sentence is life imprisonment, but the judge must determine the minimum term that must be served before the possibility of parole can be considered. This minimum term takes into account factors such as the brutality of the crime, any aggravating circumstances, and the defendant's criminal history. On August 6, 2025, Judge Lavender sentenced Roy Barkley to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 25 years. This substantial minimum term reflected several aggravating factors in the case: the random nature of the attack on an innocent victim, the extreme brutality of the violence used, Barkley's status as a fugitive at the time of the murder, and his attempts to conceal evidence after the crime. The judge noted that this was a case of exceptional gravity that warranted a lengthy minimum term. The 25-year minimum sentence means that Barkley, who was 56 years old at the time of sentencing, will be at least 81 years old before he can even be considered for parole. Given his age and the serious nature of his crime, there is a realistic possibility that he will spend the remainder of his life in prison. This outcome provides some measure of assurance to the community that this dangerous individual will not be free to harm others. In delivering the sentence, Judge Lavender acknowledged the devastating impact of Barkley's actions on Anita's family and the broader community. He noted that Anita had been simply going about her daily routine when she encountered Barkley, and that her death represented the loss of a devoted mother and grandmother who had contributed positively to her community throughout her life. The sentencing also provided an opportunity for reflection on the broader implications of this tragic case. The fact that a wanted fugitive had been able to live undetected in rural Suffolk for 2 years raised questions about law enforcement resources and the challenges of tracking individuals who are determined to avoid capture. While it would be unfair to suggest that Anita's death could have been prevented through different policing strategies, the case highlighted the vulnerability of rural communities to this type of random crime. For the residents of Brantham and the surrounding area, the conclusion of the legal proceedings marked the end of a traumatic period in their community's history. While the conviction and sentencing of Barkley provided justice, it could not restore the sense of complete safety and innocence that had characterized their quiet village before that terrible morning in July 2024. The case also served as a reminder of the random nature of violent crime and the importance of remaining vigilant even in apparently safe environments. While it would be wrong to suggest that people should live in fear or abandon activities like morning dog walks, Anita's story underscores that tragedy can strike without warning and that the assumption of safety, while generally justified, is not absolute. In the aftermath of the trial and sentencing, attention turned to ensuring that Anita Rose would be remembered not just as a victim of a terrible crime, but as a woman who had lived a full and meaningful life surrounded by those she loved. Her family, while forever changed by their loss, worked to preserve her memory and to find ways to honor the positive impact she had made during her 57 years. The community of Brantham, too, grappled with how to move forward after such a traumatic event had occurred in their midst. The village that had once represented safety and tranquility had been forced to confront the reality that evil could intrude even into the most peaceful settings. However, rather than allowing fear to dominate their lives, many residents chose to honor Anita's memory by reinforcing the values of community support and mutual care that had always characterized their village. Local authorities and community leaders took steps to address some of the safety concerns raised by the case. While it was recognized that no security measures could completely eliminate the risk of random crime, there were discussions about improving lighting along popular walking routes, installing additional CCTV coverage in strategic locations, and encouraging residents to walk in pairs or groups when possible, especially during early morning or evening hours. The case also prompted broader discussions about the challenges facing law enforcement in tracking fugitives who choose to live off-grid. While Barkley's ability to avoid capture for 2 years was certainly unusual, it highlighted the difficulties police face when dealing with individuals who are determined to remain hidden and who have the skills necessary to live outside normal society. These discussions led to renewed focus on interagency cooperation and information sharing that might help identify dangerous fugitives more quickly. For dog walkers throughout Suffolk and beyond, Anita's story served as both a cautionary tale and a reminder of the importance of remaining aware of one's surroundings. Many people who had previously felt completely safe during their morning or evening walks began taking additional precautions, such as carrying mobile phones, varying their routes, and staying in more populated areas. While it was important not to let fear dominate their lives, Anita's tragedy reminded everyone that basic safety awareness is always prudent. The investigation and trial also highlighted the crucial role played by the cyclist who discovered Anita on that terrible morning. This individual's quick thinking and calling for emergency services gave Anita the best possible chance of survival and ensured that the crime scene was preserved for investigation. Their actions exemplified the kind of community spirit and willingness to help others that represents the best of human nature, even in the face of tragedy. Bruce, Anita's loyal Springer Spaniel who had been present during the attack, became a symbol of the loyalty and innocence that had been violated by Barkley's actions. The image of Bruce remaining with his injured owner, his lead tangled around her leg, resonated with many people as a representation of the senseless nature of the crime. Bruce's survival and the care he received afterward provided a small measure of comfort to those who mourned Anita's loss. The Rose family's strength throughout the investigation and trial earned widespread admiration and respect. Their dignified handling of media attention, their cooperation with law enforcement, and their determination to see justice served for Anita demonstrated remarkable resilience in the face of unimaginable grief. Their example showed how a family can honor their loved one's memory while working toward justice and healing. The murder of Anita Rose sent ripples far beyond the immediate circle of her family and the village of Brantham. The case became a focal point for discussions about rural safety, the challenges of tracking fugitives, and the random nature of violent crime that can shatter the illusion of complete security even in the most peaceful communities. Law enforcement agencies across England took note of the lessons learned from the Anita Rose investigation. The case highlighted both the importance of forensic evidence in modern criminal investigations and the value of public cooperation in solving crimes. The digital evidence that proved crucial in Barclay's conviction demonstrated how even those attempting to live off-grid often leave electronic traces that can be followed by determined investigators. The investigation also showcased the importance of preserving crime scenes and conducting thorough forensic examinations. The evidence collected from the footpath where Anita was attacked, combined with items found in Barclay's possession, created an unbreakable chain of evidence that made his conviction inevitable. This methodical approach to evidence gathering serves as a model for similar cases and demonstrates the value of patient, professional police work. For the broader criminal justice system, the case reinforced the challenges posed by fugitives who managed to avoid capture for extended periods. Barclay's 2-year run from justice raised questions about resource allocation and the systems used to track wanted individuals. While no system can be perfect, the case prompted reviews of procedures and renewed emphasis on interagency cooperation in fugitive apprehension. The psychological aspects of the case also attracted attention from criminal profilers and those who study violent behavior. Barclay's apparent keeping of trophies from his victim, combined with the extreme nature of the violence he used, suggested psychological pathologies that are of interest to those working to understand and prevent similar crimes. This analysis contributes to the broader body of knowledge about violent offenders and may help in identifying and managing similar risks in the future. For the residents of rural Suffolk and similar communities across England, Anita's story served as a reminder that complete safety cannot be taken for granted, even in areas that have historically experienced very low crime rates. However, rather than creating a climate of fear, many communities use the tragedy as an opportunity to strengthen their bonds and look out for one another more effectively. Dog walking groups formed in many areas, allowing people to maintain their healthy routines while providing mutual support and security. Neighborhood watch schemes were reinvigorated, and there was increased communication between residents about any unusual activities or concerns. These positive community responses demonstrated that even terrible tragedies can sometimes catalyze improvements in social cohesion and mutual care. The media coverage of the case, while sometimes intense, generally focused appropriately on the facts of the investigation and the impact on Anita's family rather than sensationalizing the violence or creating unnecessary fear. This responsible reporting helped maintain public interest in the case without contributing to panic or hysteria that might have made the community's healing process more difficult. Educational institutions also took note of the case, using it as an example in courses on criminology, forensic science, and criminal justice. The clear chain of evidence, the use of modern investigative techniques, and the successful prosecution provided a comprehensive case study that could help train future investigators and legal professionals. As we near the end of Anita Rose's story, it's important to grapple with some of the more difficult questions that cases like this inevitably raise. How does a man like Roy Barclay come to commit such an act of senseless violence? What drives someone to attack a complete stranger with such brutality? While we may never have complete answers to these questions, exploring them helps us understand the nature of random violence and the challenges it poses to civilized society. Barclay's background as a fugitive who had been living off-grid for 2 years provides some context for understanding his psychological state at the time of the attack. Living outside society's normal structures, avoiding human contact, and constantly looking over one's shoulder for law enforcement creates a mental environment that can be profoundly destabilizing. The stress of maintaining a fugitive existence, combined with whatever psychological issues led to his original criminal behavior, may have created a volatile combination that culminated in violence against an innocent victim. The random nature of the attack suggests that Anita was not specifically targeted, but rather became the victim of what criminologists call an opportunity crime. She was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time when she encountered someone whose psychological state made him capable of extreme violence. This randomness is perhaps the most frightening aspect of the case, as it reminds us that no amount of caution or preparation can completely eliminate the risk of encountering dangerous individuals. The extreme violence used in the attack, described by medical experts as creating injuries comparable to those seen in high-speed car crashes, suggests a level of rage and loss of control that goes beyond what might be expected in a typical robbery or assault. This level of violence often indicates deep-seated psychological problems that may have been building for years before manifesting in such a terrible way. The fact that Barkley kept items belonging to Anita as apparent trophies adds another disturbing dimension to the case. This behavior pattern is often associated with certain types of serial offenders and suggests motivations that go beyond simple theft or even typical violent crime. The psychological gratification that some offenders derive from keeping mementos of their crimes represents a particularly troubling aspect of certain criminal personalities. Understanding these psychological factors doesn't excuse Barkley's actions in any way, but it does help explain how such seemingly inexplicable crimes can occur. It also underscores the importance of mental health resources and intervention programs that might identify and treat individuals before they progress to such extreme violence. While not all violent criminals can be identified and helped before they act, early intervention in some cases might prevent future tragedies. The case also highlights the vulnerability of individuals who engage in solitary activities like morning dog walks. While these activities are generally safe and beneficial for both physical and mental health, they do create situations where people are alone and potentially vulnerable to random encounters with dangerous individuals. This doesn't mean people should abandon such activities, but it does suggest the value of basic safety awareness and, when possible, varying routines to reduce predictability. For Anita's family, understanding the psychological aspects of the crime may provide some small measure of comfort in knowing that her death was not the result of anything she did or failed to do. She was simply the victim of a dangerous individual whose problems had nothing to do with her actions or character. This understanding, while it cannot diminish their grief, may help them process the senseless nature of their loss. As our journey through the tragic story of Anita Rose draws to a close, we find ourselves confronting the complex emotions and difficult questions that such cases inevitably leave in their wake. The conclusion of Roy Barkley's trial and his sentencing to life imprisonment with a minimum of 25 years provided a form of legal closure, but the deeper process of healing and understanding continues for all those affected by this terrible crime. For Anita's family, the end of the legal proceedings marked not an end to their grief, but rather the beginning of a new phase in learning to live with their loss. The trial had provided answers about what happened to their beloved mother and grandmother, and justice had been served through Barkley's conviction and lengthy sentence. However, no legal outcome could restore what had been taken from them or fill the void left by Anita's death. The family's strength throughout the ordeal had been remarkable, demonstrating the kind of resilience that allows people to survive unimaginable tragedy while maintaining their dignity and humanity. Their cooperation with law enforcement, their patience with the legal process, and their grace in dealing with media attention showed a family united in their determination to honor Anita's memory and ensure that justice was served. In the months following the trial, the family began the long process of building new routines and traditions that acknowledged Anita's absence while celebrating her life and continuing impact. Family gatherings would forever be marked by her empty chair, but they would also be filled with stories and memories that kept her spirit alive. Her grandchildren would grow up knowing about their grandmother through the love and memories shared by those who knew her best. The community of Brantham, too, began the process of healing and moving forward. The village that had been shocked by the intrusion of such violence into their peaceful world gradually rebuilt their sense of security while maintaining the important lessons learned from the tragedy. The increased awareness of personal safety, the strengthened community bonds, and the renewed appreciation for the preciousness of ordinary daily routines all represented positive outcomes that emerged from a terrible situation. Local walking groups that had formed in response to safety concerns following the murder continued to meet regularly, providing both security and social connection for residents who wanted to maintain their healthy outdoor activities. These groups became a living memorial to Anita, allowing others to safely enjoy the same kind of morning walks that had been such an important part of her daily routine. Bruce, Anita's faithful Springer Spaniel who had been present during the attack and had remained by her side, found a new home with family members who could provide the love and care that Anita would have wanted for him. His continued presence in their lives served as a living connection to their lost loved one and a reminder of the loyalty and innocence that had been present on that terrible morning. The footpath where the attack occurred became a place of quiet remembrance for some community members, though care was taken to ensure that it did not become a morbid attraction. Instead, it served as a reminder of the importance of looking out for one another and of the unpredictable nature of life that makes each day precious. Law enforcement agencies continued to study the case, using it as a training example for investigators and as a reminder of the importance of thorough, professional police work in solving serious crimes. The successful investigation and prosecution of Barkley demonstrated that even the most challenging cases could be solved through careful evidence gathering, modern forensic techniques, and determined detective work. The broader criminal justice system also took lessons from the case, particularly regarding the challenges of tracking and apprehending fugitives who managed to avoid capture for extended periods. While Barkley's eventual capture and conviction demonstrated that justice could prevail even in difficult circumstances, his 2-year evasion of authorities highlighted areas where improvements in information sharing and resource allocation might prevent similar situations in the future. As we conclude this tragic tale, let us remember Anita Rose not primarily as a victim of a terrible crime, but as a woman who lived a full and meaningful life surrounded by those she loved. In the 57 years she walked this earth, she raised 6 children, welcomed grandchildren into her family, and created countless memories filled with love, laughter, and the ordinary magic of family life. Her morning walks with Bruce represented just one small part of a life lived with purpose and care. These daily routines, which might seem unremarkable to outside observers, were actually the building blocks of a life well lived. They represented consistency, responsibility, and the kind of quiet dedication that holds families and communities together. The fact that such a life could be cut short by a random act of violence is heartbreaking, but it should not overshadow the positive impact that Anita had during her time with us. Every meal she prepared for her family, every bedtime story she read to her grandchildren, every moment of comfort she provided during times of difficulty, all of these created a legacy that extends far beyond the circumstances of her death. Her family carries forward this legacy every day, in the love they show to one another and in the strength they demonstrated throughout the difficult process of seeking justice for her murder. Their resilience in the face of unimaginable grief shows that evil, while it may temporarily triumph, cannot ultimately destroy the bonds of love and family that give life its meaning. The community of Brantham, forever changed by the tragedy that occurred in their midst, has also chosen to honor Anita's memory through renewed commitments to looking out for one another and maintaining the values of trust and community support that make small villages like their special places to live. As you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps take a moment to appreciate the ordinary routines and simple pleasures that filled Anita's life and that fill your own. The morning walk with a beloved pet, the quiet moments before the world awakens, the security of home and family, these are the things that make life precious, and they are worth protecting and cherishing. The darkness that invaded Anita's world on that July morning reminds us that evil exists and that tragedy can strike without warning. But the love of her family, the dedication of the investigators who solved her case, and the strength of the community that rallied around her memory demonstrate that light ultimately overcomes darkness, and that love endures even in the face of the most terrible losses. Rest in peace, Anita Rose. Your story has been told, justice has been served, and your memory lives on in the hearts of all who knew and loved you. May your family find comfort in knowing that your life mattered, that you were deeply loved, and that your legacy of care and devotion continues in those you left behind. And so ends our journey through this tragic but ultimately meaningful story, a reminder of both the fragility of life and the enduring power of love, justice, and community. As you close your eyes tonight, may you find peace in knowing that even in our darkest moments, there are those who work tirelessly to seek truth, deliver justice, and ensure that the innocent are remembered and honored. Thank you for listening to tonight's true crime story. Rest peacefully, knowing that another story awaits you next time, ready to accompany you on another journey toward restorative sleep. But if you're still awake, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories. And until next time, stay safe and take care. Good night.